Who owns the air? Well, hopefully no one. But who owns the airwaves? Or, more technically, the radio waves? Well, in the US, almost all wireless data transfer is managed by only a few huge companies. They spend billions of dollars a year to build and maintain the infrastructure needed to manage the flow of wireless data, and in turn, rake in hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue each year. It seems strange that in the age of information, we so willingly hand over our best mechanism of information transfer to large conglomerates that can be so frustrating to deal with that they routinely end up on lists of America's most hated companies. What if there was a better way to do all this? What if instead of relying on huge corporations, individuals could take part in transmitting data themselves and be rewarded for it? This is exactly what the Helium project aims to accomplish. The aptly named People's Network is a mesh of, as of March 2022, 600,000 small hotspots, spread across the globe, including more than 200,000 in the US, which validate and reward participants using a custom-built blockchain. Currently, the Helium network works on a low-frequency band of the RF spectrum, primarily geared towards low data rate applications, but work is rapidly progressing towards establishing decentralized networks for other applications, such as a 5G network capable of full cell coverage. This project was initialized by Helium, the company, which has made a concerted effort to tend towards true decentralization. It is fully open source and boasts thriving online communities with memberships in the hundreds of thousands. Today, Helium's VP of Business Development, Mark Phillips, came down to chat about the project's many technical details, history, and near-term plans. Here is our full conversation. I saw actually you started working at Helium back in like 2014 or something.
I did, yeah. So thank you for having me on this.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, it's good.
Appreciate you.
Good to be here.
Yeah.
So I've been at Helium for I think 8 years exactly.
Okay.
About a month ago, which is pretty wild. I mean, being anywhere for 8 years is becoming more and more rare, I think, these days. Yeah. Before that, I was at a company called Basho Technologies, which actually was founded here in Cambridge. So. I guess I'll give you the full story. So I went to Syracuse University, studied political science and French, which is perfect for technology. Moved to Cambridge and had a couple jobs that I got fired from, hilariously. I think I worked in like an accounting department of a restaurant group and was responsible for paying vendors, and that didn't work out too well. Bartender, and worked at a bar, got fired from that, which was quite funny. And then eventually I landed at this company called Basho Technologies, which was founded by a guy who was early at Akamai. So you remember Akamai? Yeah. Right down here. Right. Huge in 2000 for basically the first CDN network. And they're still doing quite well today. And so he was like the lead salesperson at Akamai. And he started what at the time was going to be this sort of sales optimization platform based on like data processing. Okay. And I got a job working for those guys writing sales pitches, which was fairly hilarious and meta. So my job was to write pitches for the sales team, which was in turn selling sales training and sort of sales optimization services, which was, again, quite hilarious. And so we would, get a list of companies that our targets were. We'd find like a little bit of news about them and write like a 90-word pitch that would be delivered typically over email, right? So imagine somebody scrolling on their BlackBerry, walking down the street, they get an email that says, "I saw your quote in the New York Times," and you open it and it says, "Hey, I saw where you said like we really care about making more money this quarter. I'd love to help you make more money. Who should I talk to at your team about making more money?" Right. And that was like surprisingly effective. Okay. And so I ended up running a team at that company that did that essentially as a product. And then we couldn't raise any money for the platform because, quite frankly, it wasn't very good. And so the company went through a series of layoffs. The first one I survived, and then the second one I did not survive. Mm-hmm. And so I remember it very clearly. I lost my job walking in from lunch. I forgot what the restaurant was, but the office was on Broadway. I walk in and the CEO's standing on a chair just going, "Well, that's it, guys." And I was devastated. I was, 23-year-old working for a startup. It was going to be the greatest thing ever. And about a day later, I called my boss and said, "I don't have a computer. You guys are probably liquidating assets. Can I buy it off of you?" And he said, "Well, come in and work. I need like some odd jobs taken care of, and then I'll give it to you." I said, "Sure, I'm not doing anything else." So I go in there, and there's 8 core engineers just sort of hacking away on something. And the company was super small. It was, 25 people, 10 of which were engineers and 15 in sales and marketing. And the engineering team is doing something which does not look like liquidating assets to me. And so I was like, what's going on here? And my boss, whose name was Tony, said, well, we're going to try and sell the database. So they had hired out of Akamai some incredibly smart distributed systems engineers who, quite frankly, were extremely bored when they came to this company. And so they said, well, let's just build a storage layer for this thing that no one's ever done before. So they built this thing called RIAK, R-I-A-K, which is an open source distributed key value store. And my boss said, well, you're going to figure out how to sell this thing. We're going to try and make this a company. And so basically it was me and him just like figuring out who would buy a database, which was something I'd never done, extremely challenging but very fun. And so the company raised some more funding based on that. I stayed with them for a little bit longer, and then eventually moved to San Francisco to help open the West Coast office for Basho, and that was 2010. And then towards the end of my tenure there, which was about 4 years in San Francisco, one of the guys who I managed, a guy named Sean Carey, left Basho to co-found Helium. And so he and Amir Halim and Sean Fanning, who you guys will probably know from Napster fame, and a bunch of other stuff, co-founded Helium. And then he called me up and said, hey, we're doing this crazy wireless thing. You don't know anything about wireless, but you know developers. And so why don't you come join us? And that was about 8 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Quick side tangent. Who does buy, that sort of database? Like what company is looking for that?
So our biggest customer and user at Basho was Apple. I'll probably get in trouble for saying this because it was deeply under NDA. But Apple iMessage ran for a long time, almost exclusively on 50 RIAK nodes. And so key value stores are very flexible, but they're remarkably simple. If you want to do anything complicated, you can't use a key value store for it. You can use it for the storage layer and basically storing very simple sets of data. If you want to do anything, processing related or things like MapReduce, which I don't even know if people are still using that now. You take it out of a key value store and you put it into Hadoop or something that Amazon or Google Cloud offers now. So it was simple data that had to be accessed very quickly and frequently. The big selling point for RIAK was it did very well in situations where you had to distribute data over a ton of different nodes globally, and you wanted the data to be available as much as possible. Right. So he uses this pretty interesting method called consistent hashing to basically spread key value pairs around this sort of conceptual ring inside of this database. And so that was the sort of use case, right? So small data that had to be accessed frequently that always had to be available. Wasn't always consistent, right? Because you're writing, n copies of data to 3, 5, 7 different sort of local storage engines that might exist in different places in the world. Right. But if you had to be available at all times, it was fantastic.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. In physics, at least in what I do, we're pretty behind the times and mostly store everything in like CSVs or just like text files. And we're starting to get away from that and storing things in more kind of easily accessible kind of like MySQL databases, that sort of things. We obviously we don't have like a billion users that Apple would need to manage or some company.
But you have a shitload of data, I imagine.
So much data. Yeah. It's like physicists are just really, really bad software engineers, mostly. But anyways, it's something I've had to struggle with in my PhD, so it's kind of it's something I'm interested in, I guess. But okay, anyway, so could you, as many words as you need, just say what is Helium or the Helium Network?
So in its current instantiation, the Helium Network is really an economic model for building wireless networks. And so, there's various pieces of hardware that sort of go into it, whether it's the sensors or the gateways, and there's a bunch of different sort of entities on the network, like Validators, for example. But fundamentally, what it is a method or a mechanism for incentivizing people to build wireless networks in a new way. I mean, traditionally, if you're an MNO or a mobile network operator, T-Mobile, Verizon, you are spending massive amounts of capital and you own your own infrastructure, and you're either buying tower space or leasing tower space or leasing building roof space, and spending tens of billions of dollars in CapEx and OpEx every year to do this. And so the Helium model, foundationally, it's a blockchain that gives people an incentive to actually build out the wireless network. So here we're in Cambridge. I don't know how many hotspots are in Cambridge, but there's hundreds, right? And so with the Helium blockchain and the token incentive that comes with it, people are essentially compelled, right, driven to build this network and sort of take part in it. And so today it's focused primarily on low data rate applications. So Internet of Things applications that communicate with something called LoRaWAN, which is a standard for low data rate communication. But there's really nothing stopping the network in this incentive mechanisms from transitioning to other wireless layers, and we're going to get there pretty quickly.
Yeah. So Helium started out as like a pure, it didn't have anything to do with crypto.
The sort of the recent history of Helium, so let's say the last three and a half years, have been started out with some crypto and blockchain component, and now is very focused on that. But the history of the company is more of like a traditional enterprise IoT company. So when it was founded, Amir and Sean had a lot of friends. They were living in San Francisco. They had a lot of friends who were starting companies, and some of them were hardware companies. So the first few people that they sort of talked to before they started this was somebody who was building like a smart bracelet for babies. So something you put on your newborn to monitor, things like heart rate and breathing, and oxygen levels, and then, foot counting traffic, right? So you're Rite Aid and you want to figure out how many people are coming through your door at a certain time of day. The state of the art for connecting these things at the time was atrocious. I mean, quite frankly, it's still kind of bad. But at that point, you were using a Wi-Fi network or Bluetooth, or you were paying a ton of money to build a hardware product that used a cellular network, and you put a SIM card in this thing, and the battery life was terrible. And so he said, well, it's kind of interesting. And at the time, this didn't end up being too relevant, but there was a huge chunk of spectrum that had just become available called white space, which the government made available after basically the cable companies had to switch to digital from analog. And so there's this thing called the white space spectrum. And the idea was that we would figure out how to basically build this massive network out of white space. That didn't come to pass, but we ended up building essentially, so this is the current Helium hotspot, or one of them anyways. The first thing we built was somewhat similar to this. It was this big, it had a couple of radios in it, and it used a wireless protocol called Zigbee. Well, I guess the actual standard is called 802.15.4, and Zigbee was sort of the usability layer wrapped on top of it. And that was good for longer range wireless data. Zigbee still has a lot of use in like industrial settings. And so we started building Zigbee radios that kind of looked like the current hotspot. We just called it a gateway. And we would sell that package with sensors to enterprises who wanted to monitor something. And so the platform was basically an end-to-end sensor platform where you'd take a sensor that existed, you'd pair it with some network connectivity, and then we would marry it all together with a cloud processing and storage platform. And then you as the enterprise, or you as a company building something to sell to enterprises, you were responsible for doing everything with the data. And so we had probably 3 different variations on that model from 2013 to 2017. We raised $35.5 million of funding from some tier 1 VCs, so Coastal Ventures, Google Ventures, First Mark Capital. We could just never make it work. We even went so far as to try building an actual vertical solution. So a lot of the feedback we would get is, you guys want to be a horizontal company. We think that's probably in the future for you, and IoT is a developing space, but go prove that this is useful with a vertical application. And so if you look far enough back in the news, you can find releases from Helium announcing new vertical products. So we used to have one called Pulse.
Could you what do you mean by, when you say vertical, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so Helium is inherently a platform company, right? So you typically refer to that as sort of horizontal, meaning you have a core set of functionality that you then make available to things that sort of quite literally slot vertically, if you're looking at it, I guess, as an axis. And so a vertical solution on top of, going back to the Basho React example, database somewhat horizontal. Vertical solution would be messaging on top of that. Yeah. For IoT, the sort of the horizontal piece of the platform is probably connectivity, maybe storage, but typically just connectivity. The vertical solution on top of that would be a sensing platform complete with a dashboard and alerts that pairs data from temperature sensors inside of a refrigerator with a dashboard that tells you when your sushi fridge has failed. Okay. And so there's business value sort of wrapped up into that, and people will pay money for that. We'll talk about this, but a vertical solution on top of Helium is connected mousetraps. Sure. Again, the horizontal piece is just the connectivity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. And just going back to something else you said, when you say white space, are you talking about kind of like in like radio frequency? Yes. There's kind of a section. Yep. I imagine it's like below like 1 gigahertz or something.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact chunk of the frequency band, but of the spectrum band. But yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So RF, the whole sort of band availability.
Okay. And then another thing you mentioned was you got, a decent amount of funding. I think you said $35.5 million or something like that. But you couldn't get it, just couldn't really get things to kind of click. What do you mean? Like, was there a technology issue, or was it kind of
it was complicated. So, if you look back at the history of IoT, specifically in like venture capital and sort of projections of growth, or you can go Google IoT growth projections and get reports from McKinsey and all sorts of consultancies that are projecting, hundreds of billions of devices by, I think they made the same projection every single year, like the last 15 years. What we kept running into is that no one wanted to maintain the physical wireless infrastructure. And the vision for Helium had always been to build open, decentralized wireless networks. The blockchain thing came later. It was sort of enabled us to do it. I mean, my first job at Helium was to take the first version of our hotspot, I can just call it Gateway, and go find 50 people in San Francisco to plug these things in their houses, in their apartments, in their businesses. We literally went to our VCs and said, we need people with locations in San Francisco. Can you help us? And they introduced us to every single portfolio company we had. We went out to every friend, every family member we had, and we said, hey, we got this ridiculous looking thing. You just got to plug it into power in your house and just leave it in your window. And they said, okay, sure. And so that's how we started building the first version of the network. I am willing to bet there's at least one or two of those very early, like 8-year-old Helium gateways still sitting in someone's window because people just forget about them. That's sort of the point. Yeah. So when it came to an enterprise, they would get value out of the application, right? If you are McDonald's, and make up an example, you are incentivized to make sure that your refrigerators stay online and that your food meets certain standards. A lot of that relates to temperature and prep. And typically people do this with clipboards. Now it's getting more modern, but someone goes around every 30 minutes, writes something down, they put a probe inside of a food station, and they move on. And they wanted the applications, but the network component was not something that they wanted to deal with. And so we just sort of kept hitting that. And so, without having essentially a ubiquitous wireless network, it becomes very hard to sell those vertical solutions or enable those vertical solutions in the world.
Yeah, I can't wait to talk to you about that. But before we get there, LoRaWAN, which is LoRa is just long range, I think.
That's
and
right.
It's part of the radio frequency spectrum. I actually have a few Zigbee devices in my whatever smart home sort of thing. Yeah. Why is Helium using LoRaWAN instead of some other?
Yeah.
What's wrong with Zigbee basically for IoT or something else?
Yeah, terribly hard to pronounce LoRaWAN. You can just say LoRa. That's what most people say. Okay. I think if somebody had thought more about the name, they would have changed it. A lot of the names in the LoRaWAN space are really brutal. So why Zigbee? Sorry, why LoRa versus something like Zigbee or anything?
Or Wi-Fi or anything.
Yeah. So again, our roots at Helium were in IoT and Internet of Things. We started as a company that was sort of targeting that space. We knew a lot about the space. When it came to LoRaWAN versus Zigbee specifically, and if you read the white paper, which it sounds like you did, we talk about our own sort of custom wireless protocol. Right. We backed away from that for a handful of reasons. We were initially concerned about LoRaWAN because something that we wanted to build was open and decentralized, but open in open source, right? So making everything open and freely available to the extent that, if this thing gets successful and Helium Inc. were to disappear for some reason, the network would just continue to chug along. LoRa at the time was relatively closed. So it was a specification that was, and still is, owned by a company called Semtech, which is kind of they're a silicon manufacturer essentially. And so they own the IP for this thing called LoRa. LoRaWAN is just the wireless layer on top of the RF modulation technique. And we were a little bit concerned that it was too closed, right? We said, well, what happens if they just take it all back? And so we went and thought about designing our own. I think we call it WIP in the white paper. Zigbee, and I'll get back to LoRa in a second. Zigbee was problematic in that the range was not all that fantastic, right? A few hundred meters at the most, assuming you have a really well optimized antenna and line of sight. And the ecosystem for Zigbee hardware was not that robust, meaning if you wanted to go out and get a sensor to do something, you might be able to find it, but it might be a little bit expensive, and there wasn't too many, the quantity available was not what we thought it would be, or would need to be rather. And so, we took a harder look at LoRa. We talked to some people in the community. We talked to Semtech, and we got the sense that they were going to make it more open over time, and they've done that, right? It's still, the specification itself is very open and public. You can implement LoRaWAN not relatively easily, but you could do it. And the core IP at this point is still closed source, but we feel relatively good that they're not going to go in the other direction and make it more closed.
Got it. So I guess if we could talk about the decentralization part, which is pretty important to Helium, as a company. I really like the idea of decentralization, and I'm curious why. It seems like there's the incentive for a company just to go out and build, a LoRa network and just kind of own everything. But Helium is interested in kind of doing what I would say maybe is kind of the right thing of having a decentralized network. You could call it the people's network. Any idea where that motivation came from? Like it's...
Yeah. So I don't think we could have done this in any other way. And so what I mean by that is if you look at the space of, so in LoRaWAN, you've got this type of company called an LNS, so they call them LoRaWAN Network Service Providers. They're sort of the rough analog of, a mobile carrier, so T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, but specifically for LoRa services. And in the United States, for example, you have companies like Senate and Machine Q, which is a subsidiary of Comcast, and they're very well funded, and they build LoRaWAN networks in the traditional way. They spend a lot of money out of pocket, where they charge their customers, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to build the infrastructure, and then they essentially just manage it, and they charge them a rake every month for connectivity. This model has sort of proliferated outside of the U.S. There's, I think in the world, there's 180 LNSs, 180 LoRaWAN network service providers that are charging money for people to use their LoRaWAN network. Okay. We didn't think it was possible to build something that would be sustainable if it was not open and decentralized, both from sort of a cost perspective, right? So these companies are spending millions of dollars to build physical infrastructure. There's a company out of France called Sigfox, which just filed for bankruptcy. They spent $250 million basically building a wireless infrastructure. And to their credit, the network was built. And Sigfox is relatively similar to LoRaWAN. It actually uses the same silicon, but the standard is a little bit different. And it's made for IoT applications, right? I mean, mousetraps would be perfect for it. Yeah. But they built something where the price that their tower operators were charging for connectivity would never make up the cost of the actual connectivity. Right. So, in the United States alone, for example, the Sigfox operator was paying a company called American Tower, which is a tower access company, like $15 million a year just for locations. And they had like a very small percentage of that in basically connectivity revenue. Wow. So, it was our feeling that the cost model had to change for this to be sustainable, unless you're a telco with, like cash reserves of many billions of dollars and you're just willing to spend that. But more so on top of that, we felt very strongly that sort of access and participation in this sort of thing should be totally different and new, right? You should be able to participate in the economic incentive. And so for us, building it on a blockchain, ended up being the Helium blockchain, was really the only way to get there. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So real quick, before we get into maybe kind of the hardware. So I'm a pretty reasonably large IoT kind of guy. Like my home is like mostly as decked out as it can be in smart home kind of stuff. Yeah. I've had a number of like Wi-Fi connected, like light bulbs, for example, and you can actually hear, I mean, some of them are cheap, but you can actually hear them buzzing. They kind of make noise at like 12 kilohertz or so, which is kind of at the edge depending on your age and, other factors. Yeah. But like some of these IoT things are like, you can hear them running. It's not good. I guess the idea with connecting Wi-Fi is it's okay. It is not a problem for something like a smart light because you're hooked right up to a line, so you don't have to worry about power. But you have, even in my like small, like, tiny apartment, I have connectivity issues because Wi-Fi doesn't, go great.
Yeah.
So could you just say a few words about, on Helium, I understand the range is quite high.
Mm-hmm.
The power, for each device is like really good.
Yeah.
Really low power. Is there a limit on the data? So like so we'll get into it, but you had brought, a IoT mousetrap.
Mm-hmm.
What's the limit on how frequently you'd be able to have something interact with the Helium network?
So the general answer to all this is it just depends. It depends on a bunch of stuff. But generally, when you're looking at LoRaWAN as a protocol from device to a gateway, right? So device, mousetrap to a gateway. This is a rack, black spot miner. The LoRa spec technically caps you at 5 kbits a second, which is way more than anyone's ever going to send on LoRa.
Yeah.
And inside of LoRa, there's a whole sort of scheme related to how far away you are from a gateway and sort of the power output that you're using to transmit and receive. And so, under that 5 kbits a second is where you see most of the usage. The typical usage that we see, again, back to the mousetrap, this thing will send one packet a day to just tell the world that it's alive, and then we'll send one packet when it's actually needs to be serviced.
Yep.
Actually, I don't know if you can see this on the camera, but if I do this, the light should illuminate here. Maybe? I don't know. Oh, there we go. So the light will pop. And so what's happening there is it's radio's waking up, transmitting a small packet somewhere here in Cambridge. There's a hotspot that's picked up that packet and is going to get compensated for it. But so the majority of the devices on the network are sending probably a packet that's, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 100 bytes. Okay. Right. And technically that doesn't fit in one packet on the Helium network. So anything over 24 bytes has to be broken up. Okay. So LoRaWAN is made for very, very, very small data, and it's meant to travel over very long ranges, because the idea is that you don't want to have to rely on a Wi-Fi network that's only a couple, maybe 10 feet away. Right. And even the most reliable Wi-Fi network is going to have issues, right? It's going to drop offline. The device that you have, it's going to get reset. The password's going to disappear. You're going to have to go back in and log back in through your phone app or something. We don't have these issues because network is redundant. In the event that the hotspot that's close drops off, most of the time there's another one in range. It just sort of picks it up. And the way the protocol works is it's known as an aloha protocol. So the device really doesn't have any knowledge of who it's talking to, right? So your Nest or something has to know that it's on Bobby's particle network, right? I'm not sure what you call your Wi-Fi network.
I think that's exactly it.
Some very punny sort of thing related to physics. But this just fires a packet and says, "Hey." Off you go. And you can program the firmware to basically get an acknowledgement that the packet has gone through. And there's some use cases where you'd want to do that, but generally it's fire and forget. Radio wakes up, you send a packet, you go back to sleep. You use very little power for that. The radio is not used very much for that. And off you go.
Huh. Okay. I know I'm already getting bogged down with, you just log onto your router to manage things and there's 60 devices connected and it's not, dragging down my bandwidth, but it's geez.
It's a pain.
It is a pain. Yeah. And, just cause my girlfriend will watch this eventually. I asked her to name the Wi-Fi because I previously had done a stupid physics pun and she's like, wait, I'm not ready. Like, what do you mean? And I said, okay, great. So my Wi-Fi's password or my Wi-Fi's, name is wait, I'm not ready. So it's pretty great. But, okay. So let's talk about the hardware. So let me just first say, I found out about the Helium project basically because I was talking, about, crypto with, that guy, Joe, that we met earlier. Yeah. And, HNT, the token is what, caught my eye first. Sure. And then I learned about the project, which is pretty interesting to me. So I'm an experimental physicist and I, build detectors and stuff. And it's pretty cool because it's an actual, physical device. I think you have 600,000 nodes right now.
About that, yeah.
Which is, and as a side note, I'll just say, let me see, I pulled up the, your ramping. I'll post a little graphic of it. Yeah. 5,000 hotspots, July 2020, 30,000 hotspots, May 2021. 600,000 hotspots today.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy growth.
It's pretty staggering.
Yeah.
For sure.
I hope you feel good about that because it's pretty impressive.
We feel pretty good about it.
Yeah. So, yes. All right. So could you just tell me, so this is a physical, network. There's 600,000 of these I don't know if you prefer to call them gateways or nodes or hotspots.
The jargon in the community is a hotspot. That's what all the manufacturers use.
Hotspot.
I mean, people call them gateways. They call them miners. They call them boxes. But hotspot is generally the easiest way to talk about it.
Okay, and that's what you brought right there.
Yeah, so this is one of probably about 30 different models available. So this is the rack hotspot miner. I think the actual product name is the Black Spot.
Okay.
And rack is a manufacturer that's been in the ecosystem for a long time and relevant to your. And I guess I'll walk people through it. So you order one of these from one of the. I think there's 30 approved manufacturers.
I'll put a link on.
Yeah, we call them makers.
Yep.
And a maker actually has to go through a process to get approved by the community. So there's an entity called the Decentralized Wireless Alliance, the DY for short. And the DY basically manages and governs the network from day to day. They're a very well-funded not-for-profit.
And that's separate from Helium.
Separate from Helium, yeah. And we can talk about the distinction because it's important.
Yep.
And so, they've got a whole team of people who are in business development, marketing, but mostly in engineering and operations. And so one of the biggest things that they do is they review applications from manufacturers to join the Helium network. And so Rack at this point is one of the, I think, 40 approved manufacturers, and I think we have another 25 in the queue. So it's a huge, massive ecosystem.
Okay.
And so you submit an application that says, here's what we're going to build, and mostly it's a vanilla LoRaWAN gateway. So part of the reason why we chose LoRaWAN was because the ecosystem was relatively robust from a manufacturing perspective. And so, at the time there was probably, 15, 20 companies that were making LoRaWAN gateways. They call them gateways. Due to the specifics of the Helium network, a standard off-the-shelf gateway generally didn't work, primarily because we were running a blockchain on these things, which nobody in the LoRaWAN ecosystem had ever done before, not surprising. And so they needed to basically be made a little more powerful. So this runs, I don't know if this actually runs on a Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, but that's like typically what the first ones that we built were on a Raspberry Pi 3. And the newer models went to a 3B Plus, and then we crushed that supply chain. And so this has something that's equivalent to a Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, and it's got a LoRaWAN. It's called a concentrator, basically the radio module that allows you to be a gateway versus a sensor. Okay. And then the other component that this thing has that the network needs that most LoRaWAN manufacturers did not have is a crypto element. So an onboard chip that can generate private keys and then sign transactions. So generate, store, and then sign transactions with that private key. Yep. And so, you go through a process, you build a prototype, it gets approved by the Decentralized Wireless Alliance. And then after that, you can go off and market and sell the product. Okay. And you're on the hook for fully supporting it. Okay. And then, so Helium Inc. So I'll talk a bit about the distinction. So we founded the project, right? So when we raised our Series C, so ABC round of funding, which was May of 2019. The firms that led it were Multicoin Capital, which is a firm out of Austin, Texas, which has been a long-time crypto investor and very smart and successful. And then Union Square Ventures, who's been around a little longer than Multicoin and used to do sort of traditional investments. Now they still do, but they do a lot of crypto and Web3 investments now. Yep. That round and sort of the guidance from those investors and other people that we were talking to basically pushed us down this path to figure out how to use a blockchain to build this wireless network. And so, we founded the network as Helium Incorporated. The network is the Helium Network, token is HNT. And so there is a distinction between Helium Inc. and then the protocol itself, right? The protocol is, there's a blockchain that's completely open source. There's, a market cap in the several $billion range of all the tokens out there. Helium Inc. is at this point a company in the ecosystem, which still does a fair amount of the core development. It's probably the most visible company. Sure. But we are trying very hard, and we'll make some steps in the future to basically make sure that distinction is more clear. Because back to your sort of point about decentralization, it is very important for the project, right? Both from a functionality perspective, but also, I guess, from a legitimacy perspective, right? We want people to look at the Helium network in the same way that they do with Bitcoin or Ethereum, right? Something that is adequately decentralized in the eyes of the users and also in the eyes of regulators. And so, we're getting there. We'll get there pretty quickly.
Yeah. So if I can ask tangentially related, also somewhat morbid question, but if, and you kind of touched upon it a little bit earlier, but if Helium Inc., the company, just totally vanished tomorrow, you still have 600,000 LoRa nodes around the country or around the globe. Is that network still usable? Like, how does that work basically?
Yeah. So if you asked me that question 2 years ago, I would say it's not going to function.
Okay.
Today it would. right? So the sort of drumbeat from Amir, our CEO, is we need to get to the point where if we shut off every service that we ran that's part of the network, everything would continue to run. And so, I guess the biggest components on the network now are the physical hardware, several pieces of software that sort of operate the internals, right? So the blockchain itself, which runs across a bunch of, which is pretty wild, is running on 600,000 Raspberry Pis. We've got this construct called a Validator, which is more of a traditional proof of stake node in the sort of crypto world. There's about 3,300 of those.
Right.
And then there's a few other pieces of software. So there's a mobile application that you use to deploy hotspots and manage tokens and send tokens from wallet to wallet. And there's a few other pieces of software that there's the LoRaWAN network server, that sort of manages packets from sensors back to cloud applications and so on and so forth. And then there's something called ETL, which is basically this essentially database of all the blockchain transactions that people use to sort of build applications on the blockchain itself. So exchanges, for example, like Binance US or Binance Global interact either with their own version of the blockchain that they're running or this thing called ETL. And so we are now pretty much at the point where all of those services are operated by entities that are not Helium incorporated. So the ecosystem has come through and they're running their own API nodes. There are literally hundreds of funded companies at this point that do everything in the ecosystem, from turnkey coverage deployment to operating the LoRaWAN network server, the LNS, the router it's called. People are running their own Helium blockchain nodes. The validator infrastructure is incredibly decentralized in that there's 3,500 of them. Right. There are well-funded, venture-funded companies in the ecosystem that just run validators for people. Some of them have been in the sort of validator staking ecosystem before Helium, and then some just sprang up out of the community. The most recent thing that we've done is, so when you deploy a hotspot, you download the Helium wallet app from iOS or the Google Play Store. And that is an app that we build. It's completely open source, but we build it. Over the last 3 or 4 months, we've built essentially an open source SDK that lets manufacturers, so Rack, Bobcat, Tiktaalik, Seed, implement their own onboarding process on top of the sort of the blockchain constructs, such that they are now going to exist and have their own sort of experience on top of this. And we're requiring everybody to do that. It's not optional. And this, again, is another step that'll get us out of basically being the single, supplier of something like the mobile app.
Right.
To sum it up, decentralization, I think, is a process. It's very hard.
It seems like it.
It is. I mean, you can't just found a thing on day one and have 1,000 people agree on what it's going to be. They all make the same decisions and they don't happen to work for the same company and it all just works nicely. I think, over time you sort of tend towards decentralization, which is not something I can't take credit for that line. I heard it from our chief product officer, Abai, and I'm not sure if you heard it from somebody else, but tending towards decentralization, I think, is the best way to do it. And we're probably 90% on that journey. And the last 10% will come pretty quickly.
Got it. On the kind of practical side of things, and you were just about to talk about it a little bit, when I go and buy some smart home devices, I kind of need to check this is compatible with Amazon Alexa, or this is compatible with Zigbee, or that sort of thing. I know that there's this smart mousetrap which works on Helium Network. Are there other physical IoT devices that a consumer can go and buy right now that runs on Helium? Yeah.
So the nice thing about LoRaWAN, is that if you buy a sensor that's got a LoRaWAN module, and it has a relatively recent version of the firmware for the protocol, and it's a specific type of LoRaWAN device. So they have Class A, Class B, Class C devices. Helium and most other networks only support Class A devices. As long as it satisfies all those requirements, you can put it on the Helium network. The ecosystem for consumer LoRaWAN devices is not where it's supposed to be. You can't go to Home Depot and buy a LoRaWAN smoke detector. Primarily because two things. The hardware probably wasn't cheap enough, right? So the module itself is at this point not as cheap as Bluetooth or as cheap as Wi-Fi. and the network just didn't exist, right? So you're not going to build a consumer product based on a wireless network. But I guess back to your original question, yes. So we see more and more now. So LoRaWAN had a lot of early adoption in sort of enterprise utility sort of verticals. Sure. HVAC was big for LoRaWAN. And, enterprise and developers that sort of got interested in IoT would go out and buy a gateway, like a version of this that wasn't Helium. Yep. And they get sensors and they build their house much like you have, right? Except with LoRaWAN and not Wi-Fi and Zigbee. Mm-hmm. But due to how fastly we've grown the coverage, you can now find a tremendous amount of LoRaWAN devices that are targeted at consumers. Okay. But yeah, the technology was never built for consumer use case. It was supposed to be this sort of industrial thing that would get sold to a utility that would deploy it. It would take a long time, and then they would buy sensors from a specific vendor. We're changing all of that because the coverage is so ubiquitous at this point.
I see. Yeah. Like anyone who's worked with Raspberry Pis or Arduinos more, it's pretty easy just to buy a cheap, Wi-Fi, connector or Bluetooth dongle and get your whatever weird setup you have running. Can kind of DIY people do the same sort of thing? I don't know. It sounds like the LoRaWAN, antenna or connector is a little bit more expensive, but in principle, could you, build have an Arduino, set up some, personal software and then connect it and run,
Yeah, absolutely. So there are probably 10 different development boards that you can buy now. So there's Arduino-based ones, Rack, which makes this one. Yep. They have a whole suite of developer tools. There's a company called Seed, which also has a bunch of great developer kits. They're all based on 2 different Semtech modules that can be built into a development board. So that ecosystem is very robust. There's a bunch of good SDKs that run on top of them. And you could with small amount of engineering and read some code samples, you can get something deployed in your house that monitors soil moisture, temperature of your tomato plants, and also does air humidity, the temp and humidity in your house. Right. Relatively straightforward at this point. And then from a Helium perspective, you basically take that device. Yep. You log into this piece of software that we have called Console, which is another open source free piece of software. Okay. You put in a few different keys. So you can, I don't know if they have them printed on this device. This one has a QR code, which is a huge leap, by the way, provisioning LoRaWAN devices. Typically, it's like you have to have these 3 long, huge keys: app UI, dev UI, and app key. And so you would put them into, in our case, the console interface and just say, I'm registering this device. It has this name. And then you just say, great. And the network server recognizes those keys and says, okay, we're ready to take packets from that device. Yep. And then once you fire it up, it'll do what's called a join request. Okay. Say, hey, I'm here. Will you take my packet? And then it checks your credentials against the keys in the server and says, yep, you can send packets now, and sends back a packet called a join accept. Okay. And then from there, you're good.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. That's pretty awesome. Yeah. I'll look into that when we're done.
I mean, it's not, one of the things that we're seeing from companies is, and this ties back into the incentive, is we want to sell a LoRaWAN device, but there's no coverage where we typically sell things, which is, in the United States, there's 220,000 hotspots. And I think something ridiculous, like over 50% of the population has Helium coverage, and like 75% of zip codes have some coverage, which is mind-boggling.
I'll put the map up of coverage.
Yeah, it's staggering, but still, right? You might end up in somewhere in the middle of like Kansas, or
my hometown has like one. It's pretty funny, actually. Yeah. Whereas Cambridge has.
It tends not to be one for very long though, because what happens is someone will deploy it and say like, oh well, guess we got to build some more coverage, right? And they go out and gather their friends and they find some hotspots, and it just sort of grows from there. Yeah. But people have now started shipping bundled products with a sensor and a gateway. And the reason why they're okay doing that is because obviously the gateway adds capital, adds a fixed cost to the consumer's product. But they can sell more things into that home once there's coverage. Right. So again, back to this Victor mousetrap, these guys sell every pest control solution under the sun. If there's a Helium network local there, there's 20 different sensors and 20 different services that someone might bundle into that connectivity. Right. For a developer, the ecosystem is super robust at this point. You should do it.
Yeah, I'll look into it for sure. So a question I had about the hotspots. I think you mentioned there's like 30 different hotspots, maybe something like that. Yeah. Is there any, I'm not sure if you can really say, but is there like a hierarchy of which ones is there kind of a sense of these ones are better, or are they just different?
So they're all generally created equal from an HNT mining perspective. The way that our proof algorithm, called proof of coverage, works is that it doesn't really bias sort of the capabilities of the hotspot at all, with the exception of optimizing for like antenna height, for example, and antenna power. So I don't have the antenna here, but I forgot which one this ships with, but it's like a 2 dB sort of thing that probably comes up this tall. If you spend any time in the Helium community, which you should, don't do it unless you're prepared to go fully in, because there's really only one way. You see now, this has been happening for a while, but I think people will optimize their deployments to like the top 0.1%. It's absolutely absurd. I mean, we have people who like go out and rent tower space from tower companies.
I saw someone on the Reddit for Helium that was going to try and throw up like a 30-meter personally built antenna system.
People call them sabers. They call them masts. On Reddit, you see a lot of times people posting random photos of like flagpoles. I wish I could get a hotspot up there. I've heard of people who have literally gone like, in the middle of the night and deployed an antenna on the top of a streetlight that they don't own. I mean, certainly don't condone any of these things, but from an earnings perspective, you want to optimize for the amount of coverage, right? The amount of space that an antenna can broadcast packets and also hear packets from. And that's important to be able to pick up packets from sensors, but also important to be able to prove your coverage to other parts of the Helium network. And so if you can transmit farther, you can be witnessed by other hotspots as part of proof of coverage. And conversely, if you can sort of listen better, you can witness other packets from hotspots and be rewarded for that. But when it comes to things like RAM and CPU, they're all generally sort of created equal. And we're doing a lot of work now to make that even less relevant. And what I mean by that is today, I think someone might argue with me on this, but I think we have the largest blockchain in the world, right? And one of the largest distributed systems in the world. There's 600,000 of these things that are part of the network. That's a sort of really interesting thing. It's very hard, right? Especially when you consider that you're relying on Raspberry Pis to basically process all these transactions. And so we're doing a lot of work now to basically take the blockchain processing requirements and the storage requirements off of the hotspots and move it fully into this construct called a validator. We're pretty close to that. We're probably maybe 1 or 2 months away from that. It's called light hotspots, which is a big topic of discussion in the community. You will find different models that do things like, they're ruggedized, right? They can go outdoors. You can deploy this on top of a mountain with a solar panel. Some of them do sell, retrofit antenna kits. So you want to put like a 5.1 dB antenna on day one, they'll sell you, that with it, plus like with all the, the surge protectors and everything you need to make sure that you don't get killed when you're putting this thing on your roof. But generally, all the hardware at a base layer is generally created equal.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about, physically, setting up a hotspot and running it. So when you say miner, what I think of are these like ant miner things that just, basically burn electricity and convert it into Bitcoin or Ethereum or stuff like that. And it's, if your energy is cheap, then it's a good deal. But, generates a lot of heat, burns a lot of electricity. How much are you looking, if you install, but this is not, the same thing with these hotspots. How much like energy are you, burning a month? I don't know. A couple $1 worth of
it's not even that. So the two things to think about when you're deploying a hotspot. I think back to your comment earlier about the growth ramp, right? How we went from 150 to 5,000 to 600,000 in a year and a half or 2 years. It's because it's so accessible. Not just from a sort of resource perspective, but also from a cost perspective. You mentioned an ant miner. I'm not sure what those cost now, but they're in the thousands of dollars, right?
For sure.
This black spot from Rack, I think costs about $350 US. And the price is coming down on a lot of these, right? So we should see hotspots well under $200, very soon, maybe even cheaper. And then this is related to that light hotspot thing I was talking about, where you don't need as much RAM, you don't need as much storage. It's just a very basic computer. But when you set this up, so you plug it into power, this one takes... what's this say? 5 volt. So where's the power input on this thing? here, right? So there's a micro USB. You plug it in there, and then you just put it in a wall jack, and then you plug it into Ethernet, or you use Wi-Fi. And then people do either retrofit these to use a cellular network for backhaul, or you can buy one from a manufacturer that has cellular built in. And there's reasons why you'd want to do that. So from a power perspective, it draws like 5 watts at peak, which is, I don't know, 30 cents a month in like a relatively pricey power market. The data usage is higher than it should be. So at this point, it uses tens of gigs a month. And primarily that's because of the blockchain, right? So this thing has to store the entire blockchain locally, and it has to do a lot of communication with other nodes in the network to make sure that it has the current state of the blockchain, and then it knows, what the addresses of other hotspots are and how to actually communicate with them. And there's some other stuff related to LoRaWAN data traffic that it has to sort of pay attention to from a blockchain perspective, but it's way too much data. But even so, most people don't have a problem with that because they're paying for gigabit a month plans, or
for sure.
250 gigs a month.
If you connect it to internet, it's not a problem.
It's just another device, right? It's Netflix, Hotspot, something else. So it's generally not a problem. But we do still think that it has to drop precipitously, especially when we consider that a lot of people are going to deploy these using cellular backhaul for flexibility, right? You want to put it on a roof, or you want to put it on the side of a mountain. If you're putting a SIM card in this and you're paying for 30 gigs of data a month, like that adds up. Even if you get a pretty favorable plan. So, that data requirement is going to drop by orders of magnitude in just the next couple of months, where the primary data that goes through your backhaul is just going to be the LoRaWAN packet traffic, which at this point is like less than 1% of all traffic that goes through a hotspot. But from a resource perspective, you plug it in, so you buy a hotspot, download the Helium wallet app from the iOS or Google Play Store. You create a wallet. So have you ever created a crypto wallet before?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So state of the art there is not fantastic generally. Or you've got keys and usually have words and things. Helium has a scheme where you create a wallet that you can create a wallet 2 ways. You can use what's called the command line interface, basically create and store your own keys, which is has some trade-offs. With the mobile wallet, you can press a button that says create a wallet for me, and it will spit out 12 words, like a 12-word mnemonic. And those 12 words are, the instantiation of your private key that gets stored on the device. And so you write those down, and we challenge you to basically prove that you know all 12. So when we first built the app, we used to put all 12 words on single screen. And, people would take out their phone and they go, I got 12 words here. And they do the thing where they take the screenshot and then they put it in their pocket. Terrible for security and data retention, but it was the natural thing to do. And I guarantee you there's still plenty of people out there that have their 12 words, in a Google Photos drive somewhere. Don't do that, please. Anyway, so you create 12 words, you write them down. I mean, you should write them down like 2 or 3 times, maybe put them in a password manager, put one in a safe, and then you have it there. And then, that is your wallet. That's your private key, essentially. You have a public key on the blockchain, which you can go see and explore at any point, and it'll show your hotspots, it'll show your tokens, it'll show everything that's sort of associated with it. And then that private key can be used on any number of devices, right? So if you want to have a backup device, you can log into it. And this is what a lot of people do. You have an iPhone. We all have like 10 iPhones that we don't use anymore. You go, update the software on it or the firmware. You log into your Helium wallet, and then you shut it off and you don't go back to it. Once your account is created and you've logged in, you can do a bunch of stuff. You can manage tokens. You can send and receive HNT. You can view coverage, and you can look at some network statistics. But the primary function outside of storing tokens and sending tokens is to deploy and manage hotspots. And so you press a button that says add a hotspot. You scroll down a list that says this is my model, and there's 20 different models in there. So for this one, you'd find the one that says rack hotspot miner. Hit the button, and then you power this thing on, and it goes into pairing mode. Some of them have a button that puts into pairing mode. Some of them just go into pairing mode, and so that pairs over Bluetooth with your phone. And you connect to it, and then you do 2 things. You physically assert its location on a map. So the Helium proof of coverage algorithm depends a lot on sort of the anchor location of a device. So, if we were in this building here at 142 Memorial, on the map, you'd either scroll to it or you type in 142 Memorial, and then you give it an elevation. So you say, I'm 10 meters up. And then you specify the antenna type. Typically, it's sort of pre-built in with the hotspot that you build, but you can change the antenna type. And you do that, and then you give it wireless network or a network backhaul. So if it's plugged into Ethernet, you say it's an Ethernet. If it's going to a Wi-Fi network, you pick a Wi-Fi network that shows up and put in credentials, and that's it, right? And so the whole thing takes about 3 minutes. And most of that is writing down 12 words and putting them in a safe place. And then in the background, what happens is the hotspot communicates with the blockchain, downloads the full blockchain, essentially, not the full blockchain, but enough to where we can trust it, essentially. And that can take, it could take 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
It could take a day or two.
Yep.
That's one of the biggest pain points at this point. But again, that's going to go away with this light hotspot thing. And then after that, you can do any number of optimizations, right? You can put another antenna on it. You can move it around.
Sure.
But fundamentally, it's just there, right? And as long as it stays online and connected, you provide public coverage and you earn HNT for that.
So there's a few questions I had about, I think a lot of people will probably see this project and say, oh, that's really cool. I want to get involved. You can imagine people that, I guess a few different scenarios. Someone maybe that, lives in a basement level apartment and doesn't have anywhere that's, high off the ground.
Yep.
Someone that maybe lives in the middle of nowhere and they're like, okay, like no one is using this around me. And someone like maybe lives in Cambridge and there's already 100 nodes around them. And they're like, okay, what should I do? So what advice do you have for those people who are interested in the project, but it maybe seems like not a good idea to get a miner,
Yeah, let's talk through those scenarios. So at some point, there is just enough coverage in a specific location, right? So the blockchain has this concept of something called transmit scale. And so we didn't used to have this, and I forgot when we introduced it, but there's a mechanism called Helium Improvement Proposals, or HIPs. So I mentioned this entity called the Decentralized Wireless Alliance. One of the big things they do is sort of shepherd this Helium Improvement Proposal process. And so anybody can write a HIP and say, I want to change these things on the network. And you have to sort of, justify why you want to do it. And there's a bunch of debate that happens, and there's a voting mechanism on it.
When you say anyone can propose a HIP, do you mean like anyone that owns a miner can own a HIP?
No, I mean anyone, right?
Oh, so any person.
So it's all managed through GitHub. And so you could be just a very interested wireless sort of enthusiast. You could be a blockchain crypto economics expert. You could be someone that hated the network and decided to introduce a HIP to shut the whole thing down. You can do it, right? And it'll get debated and it'll come to a vote and things like that. And the community tends to favor HIPs that can be implemented, right? So, meaning if someone writes a HIP that says, I think the token price should be $1,000, cool. I'm sure people would vote for that, but there's really no way to implement that. Whereas if someone proposes a HIP that says, I think there should be a process for approving manufacturers, which is what happened, then that can sort of be implemented and sort of debated. So there was a HIP a long time ago. Excuse me. So in the entirety of the Helium network, we don't really have any concept of geography when it comes to token generation. What I mean by that is, there's not a fixed amount of HNT for North America versus, Europe versus Asia. It's just all sort of one big network. But we did introduce the idea that, there should only be so much density of coverage. And when we reach a certain point, or I guess it's a scale, it's not binary, as the coverage sort of gets more dense, that the reward for that area might want to be less than an area that has, less coverage, but like good enough coverage for sensors and devices. That's really what we care about, right? Building network coverage that a device can use. So Cambridge, Los Angeles, New York, Boston, London, there's probably 40 or 50 cities, just in the United States, that have very good, if not too much helium coverage. I think I was looking at some stats last night. I think Los Angeles has like 6,000 hotspots. Now, Los Angeles is big.
Sure.
It's super sprawling and notoriously hard to cover with wireless. It's probably too many. And so what we see is people actually migrating coverage out, right? Because they deploy something and it only earns, half of what the network average is over any given period of time. And so they actively call up their friends like, hey, I will give you this thing called a Helium hotspot. Sometimes they know about it, sometimes they don't. Put this in your window, plug it in, and I'll give you 20% of the HNT that it produces. Right. That model, it might not be 20% share. It rotates between like 20 and 70, depending on who you are, what company you're running, has proliferated wildly.
Sure.
To the point where there's probably close to 100 companies, where companies, either a single person buying hardware, like a venture funded company,
Sure.
Providing coverage in that model. So they basically share HNT rewards, and they get very sophisticated using some community tooling and some proprietary stuff that these people build to figure out where to put these things, right? You can go to a website. There's a company out of Philadelphia run by a longtime community member called FairSpot, where you can go to their site. You can say, hey, I want to host a hotspot. You put in your address, and then they say, great, the network needs coverage there.
Yep.
We will send you one, and they give you 70% of the earnings, I think, and they keep 30%. That's a fantastic model.
Yeah.
So when you think about living in a place like Cambridge, it's never really a bad thing to deploy a hotspot, only because the cost of operating is so low. Like, you quite literally forget about it.
Right.
But people tend to find other places to put them. And the Helium community is remarkably resourceful.
Sure.
There are most people who are in it. You could ask any of their family members, their grandmother, their daughter, their sister-in-law. They're going to tell you how Helium works, because they're not running a hotspot. They've been talking to the people in their family about how to do it. So that tends to be what people do. Some places, when you're starting from scratch, something I often remind people of is, like, every single city that has Helium coverage started with just one hotspot. I mean, we started in Austin, Texas. We did a bit of a kickstart there. So that was August 2019. That was the first city where we launched. We pre-sold 150 hotspots into that city. But on day one, the first one came online, and then sort of everybody filled in afterwards. And people come to the network for a variety of reasons. The incentive is a big driver, right? People see the idea that they can earn something for providing this utility. But I will say, if you look at our Discord community, which is almost 200,000 people at this point, or anything on Reddit or TikTok, I don't know why, but for some reason the 18 to 35 crowd on TikTok is just, there's
I didn't know that.
Hundreds of videos that appear weekly for people talking about optimizing hotspots and earning HNT and all this stuff. It's wild. Interesting. They get very committed to it.
Sure.
They feel like they're part of something.
Yep.
And what happens for a lot of these people is that, again, the economics are great. Like, people think about the tokens and how much they earn, but they more so get very interested in the idea that they're taking part in building a new model for deploying wireless networks. We built the largest wireless network. We've been told that it's the largest contiguous wireless network in the world. I'm not sure how you prove that, but I'll say it because it sounds cool.
You can't disprove it. So
there you go.
Yeah.
But we built this primarily with people who'd never heard of LoRaWAN, who didn't really know much about wireless.
Yeah.
But they did it, and they continue to do it, and it continues to get better and more resilient.
One other question about people who might be interested in see this project. There is currently a pretty long backlog, a few months to maybe 5 or 6 months on buying a miner. There's people who might be worried about buying a miner now. And then in this time that goes between today and 6 months from today, all the hotspots that they were going to put, or all the locations they were going to put their hotspot, is now taken up by someone else. Do you have any advice for people who might be concerned about that?
So the supply chain has been problematic.
Sure. Well, for everything.
For everything. Yeah. And we managed to get extremely popular at a time when global supply chains were crushed generally.
Right.
And LoRaWAN as a space was never projecting to do as much coverage. I mean, at this point, the Helium network adds like 3,000 of these every single day across the world. If you look at, the entire LoRaWAN ecosystem net of Helium, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I would imagine that in all of last year, outside of Helium, there was probably only like 50,000 LoRaWAN gateways total added to the entire, global ecosystem of coverage, again, net of Helium. And so Semtech, the company that licenses the IP and sort of manufactures the concentrator chips, was crushed, right? In a good way. They're a publicly traded company. They're pumped about it. And we're, at this point, what we've heard from manufacturers is that the backlog for just the LoRaWAN gateways is over, I think, 3.5 million units, right? And these are orders placed with Semtech to build versions of this. Sure. So the coverage isn't going to slow down. If you're considering deploying a hotspot and you're concerned both with the lead time and with, someone else, I guess people talk about their hex, right? So in the ecosystem, so in the Helium network, we use this system called hexagons, People know what hexagons are. But there's a project that came out of Uber a couple of years ago called H3, and they took the map, the world map, and broke it up into hexagons of different sizes. And so I think it's hex 1, maybe hex 0 through hex 15. And so, I think hex 0 is the entire world, and hex 15 is like, this tiny little half a foot space. So we use that system to break up the world, and there's a few different hexagons that are a bit more important to Helium. And people talk about, right, someone showed up in my hexagon, and what am I going to do? That's how it's supposed to work, right? My sister just moved to the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, and she called me up. She was like, and she has a hotspot. She's like, "Oh my God, there's already 2 hotspots in my town." I was like, "Yeah, that's how this is supposed to work."
Sure.
I don't know. I would say if you're committed to building coverage, you should just go down that path and do it. Mm-hmm. And in the event that you get a hotspot, and the very unlikely scenario that the area you live in needs no more coverage, mm-hmm. I do not anticipate you'll have any trouble finding somewhere else to put that.
Sure.
So I don't think that should sort of block people. I do. The supply chain backlog is very frustrating. It's frustrating for us because we want the network to go as fast as we can. I think as big as we've grown, we would probably be much bigger if the supply of LoRaWAN gateways or concentrators specifically, and the other components was bountiful, I guess. But one of the nice side effects is that we sort of prevented other LoRaWAN networks from growing in parallel while we were sort of just sucking up all the supply, which is pretty funny.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you, in terms of kind of competition, either big industry giants or other mm-hmm. decentralized networks, I couldn't find too much. The only thing I could find is Amazon trying to do an mm-hmm. annoying thing where they basically have a private relay between Echo devices and stuff. Do you have any kind of competitors that you're worried about, or not even worried about, but that you know about?
So it's called Sidewalk, Amazon Sidewalk.
That's right.
Why did you say it was annoying?
I don't like Amazon very much. Okay. Yeah, it's annoying because I know it's something that you opt into, but Amazon's I guess it's a publicly traded company, but they do a lot of things that I don't like, and I don't. Yeah. I'm actually hoping to talk to. If you see this, please come on. A company. There's actually a couple of companies that make kind of like not open sourced, but you have like Amazon Echo devices. You can also have like Apple HomeKit or mm-hmm. Google HomeKit, whatever. There's Amazon, Apple, and Google, mm-hmm. and they're basically convenient ways to get inside your home sure. and sell you stuff. Yeah, and I don't want that. Right. I want an actual eventually maybe we'll get to some Jarvis level device or something. Right. But you want it to be not something that's selling you stuff all the time. Yeah. So Amazon is annoying for me for that reason. Like I don't want Amazon in my house, Yeah. Anyways, so I saw that they were doing a Sidewalk thing, right? Which is good, but again, like it should be not right. Amazon company doing that.
Yeah. So from a competitive perspective, it's kind of interesting. If you look at just the LoRaWAN network space, right? Just the market for these vertical applications mm-hmm. and connectivity, independent of the blockchain component. There are, as I mentioned, globally 180 companies that are known to the world to sell connectivity services on top sure. of LoRa. In the United States, you've got players like Semtech and Senate and MachineQ, which I mentioned before. There's probably 4 or 5 other ones in the U.S. Canada has companies like Extelia. The biggest one in Europe is called Actility. There's a big one that's active in Brazil called Everynet. We actually, so from a Helium Incorporated perspective, right, sure. the commercial line of business, we used to think very fiercely about how to compete with these companies, right? Sure. We're going to put them out of business because we want all the device traffic and we're going to figure out how to make money on device traffic. Yep. We decided probably about 6 months ago that fundamentally we didn't care about that. And that the biggest thing that we had to offer to the world, I guess, to the IoT ecosystem was just ubiquitous coverage that grew much faster than anybody else could plan and sort of anticipate for. And so on the heels of that, we've actually been able to work with companies that used to be our competitors in such a way where they are now essentially customers of the blockchain. And what I mean by that is recently we started announcing these agreements that I worked on specifically called roaming agreements. So in traditional cellular sort of telco space, you have roaming agreements that exist, right? So T-Mobile and Verizon and Dish and AT&T, they all pay each other for access at different points, right? So if you're on AT&T, but you wander into an area where there's no coverage, you jump onto T-Mobile, and then, AT&T pays T-Mobile for that access essentially. You don't know about it, right? Because your phone just does the right thing. LoRaWAN has had this concept for a long time, right? They'd had roaming, but no one was able to build big enough coverage to make it useful. And they had sort of this very dusty specification that was sort of mired in politics, and nobody wanted to implement it. And so it never happened. And so we said, well, listen, we have a stupid amount of coverage, and we're adding more coverage every day than you're ever going to add in like the next year. Just use our network. Right. Yeah. You guys are a vertical company. Right. You Senate, and I'm using Senate as an example because they are one of our roaming partners. Okay. You care about going to cities and selling applications to utilities that monitor gas meters and trucks moving around towns. And you build core network coverage, and that's great. Sure. But we're going to continue building coverage. And the price to use the Helium network from a roaming perspective is so stupidly cheap that you should just essentially buy access to the network and then go to your customers and say, listen, we've got the core Senate network, and then we also have access to 200,000 other LoRaWAN gateways in the United States that your applications can use seamlessly through the Senate network. And that has worked fantastically. So we've got, I think 4 roaming partners announced now, with another 4 or 5 in the queue. And so from a competition perspective, we are entirely happy to let those companies capture most of the traditional sort of enterprise revenue that comes with these device deployments. All we care about is the utility of the token. We just want to see HNT be used as a utility for connectivity. We just want the hotspot operators to be rewarded for all this coverage that they're busting their ass to build. So I guess that's the LoRaWAN vertical sort of competition. From a blockchain perspective, you've got a couple other decentralized sort of wireless mining networks out there. There's a few that have been around for a long time. That sort of claim to be IoT, but they just use a thing on your phone that's like a Bluetooth sort of shared network that doesn't really work. There's another one that uses LoRaWAN. Sidewalk does use LoRa. But true to form for Amazon, it's something that they built themselves that runs on the LoRa silicon, but it's like a very custom protocol. I don't really know. So we'll certainly compete with them. What I think actually would be really interesting is if they were to use the Helium network. And what I mean by that is, so you've got the blockchain, right, the Helium blockchain and the token, and we've got this incentive mechanism that today has primarily been used for IoT and LoRaWAN, right? So if you look at the code and the sort of the documentation and how the actual HNT gets rewarded, there's a set schedule essentially for when over every 30 minutes some amount of HNT gets produced and it goes to these different parties. We haven't talked about this much, but we're moving into a world where we do 5G and then Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi will come. But the community is actually moving towards a system where any wireless protocol can define their own earning economics on top of the layer 1 Helium blockchain. And so, this happened after conversations with carriers that said, listen, this is really interesting to us. How do we figure out how to take our licensed spectrum, right? Stuff that we've paid the FCC for, or, the equivalent body in another country to license this spectrum for our handsets. How do we incentivize that coverage build out in Helium? And we said, well, we don't have a good system for that right now, but let's think about it. And so, again, back to what the Helium network is a sort of economic model for building wireless networks. We should have a way to incentivize any wireless network, terrestrial or maybe even extraterrestrial, right? So satellites, right? How do you, if you operate 1,500 LEOs, maybe it's interesting to figure out how to incentivize deployment of more ground stations. And so there's a system that's sort of actively being discussed now. It's not been implemented. It's still very early to basically say, okay, you want to build a satellite token. Great. You've got HNT on top of that. So in blockchain, you sort of have layer 1 blockchain. So Ethereum, Bitcoin, Solana, Helium, like 15, 20 others. And then you've got layer 2, right? So in Ethereum, all these layer 2 applications are these ERC 20 or ERC, I forgot the most recent spec, that do things like all the DeFi stuff,
right?
At least on Ethereum. These are all layer 2 applications.
Yeah,
you can, and we are now conceiving of a way where wireless layers are essentially layer 2 on top of the Helium HNT layer 1 blockchain. So you can envision a system where a satellite provider might say, I want a satellite token, and I care about incentivizing ground stations to be deployed and for the connectivity to those ground stations to be solid, and for the traffic from neighboring devices to come through that ground station. And you can craft economics on top of that with your own token that is still tied to HNT from a utility perspective. So anyways, back to Sidewalk. If you're listening, I think it would be very interesting for them to consider using the Helium infrastructure and the incentive mechanism, because I imagine someone like you might be a little bit more likely to want to deploy this if there was something in it for you, right? Some incentive, right? Maybe one of the models that we're seeing discussed a lot, and this will show up relatively soon, is the idea that you deploy wireless coverage. There's a Helium element to it, right? Maybe it's a LoRaWAN gateway, or there's a cellular 5G component or Wi-Fi. You provide public coverage. You earn HNT, you get a utility from the actual coverage itself. So one of the things we struggle with LoRaWAN is that most people who deploy it don't use it. Right. Yeah. You might, because you're sort of hackery and you'll build a device. But most people are not putting sensors on it. More and more, they have the chance to with consumer applications. But as we move into 5G and maybe Wi-Fi eventually, your phone will use it. Right? Your iPad will use it. You'll know exactly why that is. Your neighbors will come over and they'll use it, and you'll say, like, hey, this is a network I built. Come use it. You'll earn a token, HNT, for that, or something based on HNT. And then wouldn't it be interesting if you could just pay for your service or offset the cost of your service, right? With the mining offset? Yeah. So I think that's where we're going to see a lot of these things going.
Interesting. So when you say, kind of other companies might be able to build off of the Helium infrastructure, do you mean specifically just the Helium blockchain, or also like the Helium, physical, hotspots?
Mostly the blockchain. Although, I mean, it won't work without the hotspots. Right. It'll depend on what wireless layer you're targeting. Yeah. But I mean mostly the blockchain and the incentive mechanism and the token itself.
Yeah. So I have a number of questions to ask you about the kind of blockchain software side of things, but we've kind of talked a little bit about the 5G and other network stuff, so maybe I can just hop into it now, because I'm pretty sure I'll fact check myself on this, but stuff like internet providers, like whatever, Verizon, Comcast, etc., like routinely the most hated companies in America by like a lot. I certainly have had a huge number of struggles with them, and
you have no choice.
Exactly. I could go into a huge tangent about just, it's just extremely frustrating. Yeah. It's like, you need internet. Like, it's not a question. I saw this thing called FreedomFi, which I'm not entirely sure if that's like an offshoot of Helium or if it's a different company that's working with Helium. But what I read, my understanding is kind of, instead of just the LoRa, the low frequency communication, actual 5G, connect your phone to it, that sort of stuff. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah. So again, back to Helium being a model for wireless networks. So if you read the white paper, we talk about the blockchain being useful for pretty much anything wireless. And the community, I mentioned this thing called the Helium Improvement Proposals, or HIPs. The community will sort of push us where they think it needs to go. And so as the LoRaWAN network had been rolling for about a year and a half or 2 years, the beginning of last year, a company called FreedomFi introduced the idea of a 5G hotspot, right? So the same incentive mechanism tuned for cellular communication, same token, different piece of hardware, and fundamentally a different use case. So migrating from just low data rate, long range devices to handsets, right? So less about sending data about mousetraps and more about streaming Facebook and watching things on YouTube. And so they proposed to the community that we integrate cellular earning economics. I think it was HIP 37. And then they also submitted an application to build the first 5G enabled hotspot. And so that happened about a year ago. That was approved overwhelmingly because people saw, the future, right? Okay, we've got this blockchain. IoT is interesting and it will continue to be interesting. We have to sort of expand the footprint of what this thing can do. And so they started shipping. I mean, this is a common occurrence in the Helium community. So you get a hotspot approved, you put it on sale, and then everything crashes. Like websites go down.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the wait list is even closed.
Yeah, I mean they stopped. So they opened up they opened up the sale of this gateway, and they sold 10,000 units in like an hour and a half, and then they shut it down because they were just concerned that they couldn't fulfill orders. And again, with supply chains, the sort of the 5G chip ecosystem is only so big, and there's a lot of 5G chips out there, but like we'll probably crush that too. So anyway, so they started down this path. They started shipping their first version of it's called a hotspot, but technically it's an indoor 4G LTE small cell. Okay. And so the way that cellular networks have been traditionally deployed is towers. Right? You lease a tower space, you put a huge sort of base station up there, you run a bunch of other hardware, you connect it to fiber, and you sort of backhaul out of there. There are a growing number of sort of hardware vendors building these things that are called small cells that are small, right? And they get deployed in much higher numbers to build sort of greater density at a local area, at a local level. And with 5G, that's kind of the requirement, meaning 5G is not going to work if you just maintain tower space, or you have to deploy tons of these sort of 5G radios, essentially these end nodes. The FreedomFi hardware currently is a 4G LTE indoor small cell. And so you deploy it much in the same way that you do this Helium hotspot, the LoRaWAN hotspot. You put it on a network, you add it to the blockchain, and as long as you have a phone that can connect to it, I can talk about what that means, you can use it for coverage. And so FreedomFi is a company that's active in the Helium ecosystem. Helium Inc. sort of guided them from an engineering perspective on how to first integrate with the blockchain from a cellular perspective, because it was entirely new. Nobody had done this before. And we worked with them to put an agreement in place with Dish Networks. So Dish is an MNO that quietly, by the way, has built some massive spectrum of things. Maybe not quietly. Dish owns a tremendous amount of spectrum, which I think is something that they don't get a ton of credit for.
Sure.
So Dish has agreed to be the first roaming partner with the Helium network. And so these carriers look for ways to basically build their coverage footprint out without having to spend money on capital.
Sure.
And there's tons of companies. Like if you go to San Francisco, SFO, San Francisco Airport, and you're on Wi-Fi, you're on like a Boingo wireless network.
Okay.
So you've heard of Boingo.
Of course.
It's not called Boingo, but they sell basically connectivity. They go and install the hardware, they maintain it, and then they just license it to people to use. Yep. And so that's similar to how you can think about what FreedomFi is building on top of Helium. Okay. So at this point, I think there's probably 5,000 small cells that have been deployed.
Okay.
And so if you are in an area where there's coverage and your phone has a SIM or an eSIM that can access the FreedomFi Helium footprint, you can get on that network. And then if you are a Dish subscriber or a Dish MVNO subscriber, so an MVNO is a mobile virtual network operator.
Okay.
So in the telco space, you've got 4 or 5 in the U.S. 4 or 5 anchor MNOs: T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, Dish, and then the U.S. Cellular, and maybe one other. Okay. And then they have all these MVNOs, basically huge customers of theirs that just buy bulk connectivity and then sell something directly to consumers. So Mint Mobile, Boost, Consumer Wireless. There's like hundreds of MVNOs.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So if you are, and Dish does most of their consumer stuff through MVNOs. So if you're a Dish MVNO subscriber, like Boost Mobile, for example, you can connect to the Helium network. Okay. And then Dish has done an integration with FreedomFi in the back end to basically, integrate that data with their cellular core, it's called. There's another MVNO, called GigSky, which has also agreed to access the Helium network footprint that FreedomFi has built. So,
we have, the Helium hotspot, and that gets connected up to a small LoRa antenna. The FreedomFi, what does that physically look like? Is there like an antenna? Like I don't know. I don't really know much about
so it's
how
actually
4G works.
2 pieces of hardware. Okay. So it's the radio. So this one's like a fully integrated. You can think of it as 2 things. It's a gateway.
Yep.
And then it is the blockchain minor component, and there's an antenna that comes off here. Yep. With the FreedomFi setup, there's 2 pieces. There's the actual end node, the radio itself, which is like, I don't know, like, say, it's a little smaller than this. I've got it in my house. It's like, this big, right? And so, it's maybe Well, I mean, a little slimmer like that. And you deploy that, right? So you set that thing up, you plug it into power, and then it uses a local gateway for the sort of blockchain and what's called the core, right? The cellular core component. So it's two pieces of hardware versus one for an actual hotspot.
Okay. And when you say gateway, you mean something that connects you to the network, basically?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And in the case of FreedomFi, it kind of connects. You need to have a different cell phone plan. Like you have a cell phone plan with Verizon or something, and then that gets broadcast through the FreedomFi physical thing.
Yeah, so that wouldn't work today. You would have to have a SIM card or an eSIM. So eSIMs are these pretty. So you buy a phone. Yep. It's got a physical SIM, right? That's your sort of unique identifier. Right. Yep. There's a lot of cost that comes with SIMs,
sure.
And it's it's a really old way of managing things. And so a lot of carriers, there's a spec now that is related to eSIM, and specifically eSIMs are applications that you just download, and you say instead of putting a physical hardware SIM in this card, I have an eSIM that gets me onto this network. So if you have an eSIM via GigSky, that's the other own provider they have, you can join the Helium network coverage from your phone, but you're on the GigSky network essentially.
I see. Okay. And when you say, you're on the Helium network, I'm a little bit confused. So when you say Helium network, to me, that means like the LoRa network. But that's not what you're talking about here with the phones, right? Okay. That's the different, I guess would be 4G.
I think, so when I say Helium network, I specifically mean that you are paying the blockchain for access.
Okay.
So a sensor pays the blockchain for access. A handset pays the blockchain for access. The consumer or the owner of the sensor may not be the party that pays the blockchain for access. With FreedomFi, for example, you as a consumer are paying. So if you're a GigSky subscriber, you pay them $10, $20, $30 a month for the cellular coverage, for the subscription. FreedomFi pays the Helium blockchain on your behalf, right? So they literally go out and they purchase all the packets coming from your handset.
Gotcha.
And they pay something called data credits, which we haven't talked about. So they pay data credits for that data. And then on the back end, they're getting paid by GigSky to basically facilitate the transfer of data from a handset back to the GigSky infrastructure.
I see. And would you perceive that would, kind of cost less than current solutions, or would it just be nicer in the sense if you don't have these?
It should cost significantly less. So I think the current rate in the community that's being discussed for price per gigabyte is about 50 cents per gig. And so when you think about that, so based on our sort of research and talking with companies in the ecosystem and cellular providers that are actually doing roaming agreements, the price. So they usually pay. They structure these roaming arrangements around something called tonnage pricing. So you're Verizon and you're T-Mobile, and T-Mobile is going to roam onto Verizon, and the price is $1.25 per gig.
Sure.
Right. So I'll charge you $1.25 per gig for all the data coming out of your handsets and send it back to you. Because of the model with Helium, where the owners of the network, right, people like you who are deploying it, basically take on the sort of capex burden in a very small portion, right? That gets spread across the network in a huge way, such that you don't have to charge an exorbitant amount of money to sort of make up your capital cost. So we anticipate the price per gigabyte to be significantly lower.
Okay. Yeah. One thing I saw when reading through the Helium and FreedomFi stuff is that there's kind of a possibly, well, I guess it's not a technical issue, a legal issue of a lot of, at least cell phone providers have a clause where you're technically not allowed to resell any part of your, connectivity.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that something to worry about? Is that something you see getting resolved?
So we generally advise. We don't really advise on much, quite frankly. Our suggestion is that you read your terms of service, and if you think you might be violating them, then you don't deploy something, or you do, and you get slapped for it. Yeah, but we don't get involved in that too much.
Yeah.
The person or the company deploying the coverage is basically responsible for ensuring that they're complying with any terms of service that they might have to consult. Obviously all the hardware that gets built is compliant to whatever wireless regulation that applies to the country. So FCC in the United States, ETSI and IC in Europe, and Canada. I'll give you one anecdote, which I think is actually kind of interesting. So I spoke recently with an executive at a major carrier in the United States, and they got in touch because what was happening, it's quite funny. So people were taking hotspots and they were retrofitting them with cellular backhaul, right? So in this thing, you've got an Ethernet port, so you can buy a dongle, it's called, that plugs into this and has a cellular, so it takes a SIM card and you can use a cellular backhaul. And some hotspot manufacturers will build cellular-enabled hotspots from day one. They'll come ship, with a SIM card.
Sure.
And so, because the Helium community is very good at optimizing, people look for the cheapest cellular backhaul data plan. And so there was one of these carriers had a SIM card that was specifically meant for handsets. That was like an uncapped data plan that only cost like something very cheap, right? And so, this had been discovered by a few people in the community, and they bought a bunch of these SIM cards and they put them in hotspots. And this carrier was not too happy about it, right? Because it was using more data than they're supposed to.
Sure.
And through some, through some determination, this carrier decided that these hotspots, and it wasn't a large amount, but a few were violating some terms of service.
Okay.
And so I was contacted by somebody at this company saying, hey, we're curious about Helium. Can we have a conversation? I said, sure. And so, he told me the story and I thought it was quite funny. And he said, I will tell you that after this happened, we convened a bunch of meetings internally. And we, the legal team came together, the business team came together, the executive leadership team came together, our security team came together, and we debated what we should do about, the Helium network. Is this something that we want to embrace? Or do we want to sort of take a more adversarial stance? And what they determined at the end of these discussions, again, this rolled all the way up to like executive level leadership at a major telco, was that they wanted to figure out how to work with the Helium network. They saw it more as an opportunity for them versus something that they needed to figure out how to sort of compete against, right? So, those conversations are happening.
Sure.
And I thought that was very encouraging, right? They basically said, let's figure out how to work with these guys. And now at this point, that specific company has been sort of actively talking to hotspot manufacturers to say, listen, like, what if we built you guys a SIM card that was specifically for, hotspot backhaul connectivity? Would that be interesting to you? We'd price it aggressively. It would have all these features, so on and so forth. I thought that was very encouraging.
Yeah, that's good to hear, at least in my opinion. This might be a stupid question. I just don't really know enough about kind of how cell services work. But if you look at the Helium network, LoRa, okay, at the end of the day, you need to connect it to the internet.
Sure.
And, each individual person is going to pay, Verizon or whoever their internet service provider is for that. Is there any world where, you can just have enough 5G nodes, however many millions you need across America, and then you don't have a need for something like AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile? Or do you always need these big kind of companies to serve as a backbone and then distribute the data?
Yeah.
Specifically for like cell phones and stuff.
Not a stupid question. We need them now, right? We need the fiber. We need things that have been trenched to the home. Mm-hmm. We think very heavily about a future where we're not sort of tethered to terrestrial networks. Yeah. There's a lot of interesting approaches. Maybe some combination of a fixed wireless network talking to satellite backhaul, where you can completely sort of exist, right, without having to work with existing ISPs and carriers. Mm-hmm. So on some timeline, I think we could get there. I can tell you that the people in the community think very sort of heavily about that. I think a lot of the people in the Helium community sort of dream of a scenario where connectivity just exists on its own and is like entirely operated by the community. Yeah. It'll take us a while to get there, but that's certainly a possibility.
Okay, interesting. All right, so I wanted to ask this question. You've mentioned a number of times You brought up validators
Mm-hmm.
and I guess light hotspots. Could you talk about that and what is a validator versus a normal hotspot?
Yeah. So, the Helium Network has grown into this, again, what I think is the largest blockchain in the world if you look at actual sort of nodes on it. When you start a project like this, you say, well, eventually we want to be the largest, wireless network in the world. That's like step 645, right? We're at step 1, which is get the first piece of hardware out there and turn on the blockchain and see what happens.
Sure.
And so when we first designed the network, we built this consensus protocol, which we we borrowed the name from an academic paper out of, University of Michigan. I'm making that up. The guy's name is Andrew Miller. His team did this thing called the Honey Badger BFT. And so we built this consensus protocol based on
I just want to chime in and say that if anyone is nerdy enough, they should read that 2016 paper because they just repeatedly say Honey Badger doesn't care. And
we borrowed that from Andrew Miller and his team at forgetting the university. It's a short paper too. It's not that long. And so, we designed this system built on Raspberry Pis where, you might have 100, let's say, when we launched in Austin, Texas, for example, there's 150 hotspots on the network. The consensus group was a subset of that. So at any given time, at that point, I think we had 16 of the 150 that were elected to this thing called the consensus group. And in blockchain networks and protocols, on some sort of regular cadence, this consensus group comes together, agrees on a set of transactions that have occurred in a short window in the past, and they mine these into the blockchain, and they just sit there forever, unchanged. And so, having these Raspberry Pis operate the consensus group worked really well for a long time, quite frankly, probably longer than we thought it would, right? To the point where there was hundreds of thousands of these things out there that, every 30 minutes would come together and elect 16. It's kind of wild. 16 of, 200,000 to be the consensus group for, we use something called an epoch. So epochs in the Helium blockchain are 30 minutes long. So every 30 minutes, you get like a partial shuffling. This is how it used to be. You get a partial shuffling of the 16 consensus members. They would be elected to consensus, and then they would, get all the transactions, do a bunch of sort of negotiation and say, here's what I have, here's what you have, do you agree on this? And then they would, mine the block and H&T would be distributed at the end of 30 minutes at the end of this epoch. This system, like I said, worked much better than any of us had anticipated, especially when you consider the fact that hotspots generally are deployed on like consumer grade networks. They have like 2 gigs of RAM and maybe 32 gigs of storage.
Sure.
And they're just under provisioned things, right? And the network can't be counted on. This is why we use that Honey Badger BFT, because it was specifically optimized for untrustable, poorly connected entities, right? But you always had to be able to come to consensus in some sort of reasonable way. And again, that generally worked. There were some bugs and some hiccups, but it worked. But we needed a sort of a more resilient way to do this, right? And so as we looked at the network and said, well, shit, what happens if we go from 100,000 to 1 million? We got to get the blockchain off of these hotspots. So validators in the Helium ecosystem, and validators are a relatively well sort of trod path in blockchain. If you look at the proof of stake ecosystem, you've got, Ethereum, which is transitioning to proof of stake. You've got, Solana, you've got Polkadot, like, 10 or 15 sort of major layer 1 blockchains that use proof of stake. And I think it was January of last year, the idea of a validator was introduced to the community. Helium sort of spearheaded that approach. Sure. And so these are now much more traditional, sort of larger computers that run in data centers and colos. And there's about 3,500 of them at this point, which is pretty remarkable if you consider the fact that to stake a validator, so when you operate a validator, you take some amount of the asset, in our case it's HNT. To stake a validator, you need 10,000 HNT. At the time the proposal was introduced, I think the price of HNT was like $3 or $4 US. And people at that time were like, oh, this is so expensive. No one's going to commit $40,000 to doing this. And fast forward now, I don't know what the price is today, but we've been in plus 20 US territory for a long time.
Yep.
We've raced up to 35% of all HNT locked up in validators, something like I don't know, 700 million worth of nominal value that's locked up in validators. And so these now play the role of consensus, right? So every 30 minutes, I think we're up to 45 validators now. 45 validators get elected to the group, and then they are responsible for processing transactions and essentially securing the blockchain. And in exchange for that, right, in exchange for staking 10,000 HNT and keeping your validator online, making sure it's well connected, making sure the software is up to date, making sure it's relatively stable, you are rewarded with HNT over time. So the validators and the consensus group specifically capture 6% of all HNT over any given period of time.
So I hope you don't mind, but I'd like to go a little bit slower through that, just because.
Of course. Yeah.
Sorry. No.
I'm used to just going with it, so I can't slow it down.
No, I don't know enough about this as I'd like to, so I hope you don't mind me.
No, I'm happy to go slow. Yeah.
You borrowed this thing called Honey Badger BFT, which is asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerant. Algorithm, which is like, what the hell does that mean? But it's okay. It's not, basically the idea is you can have some nodes that they don't even give you an answer on where stuff is and how do you come to a consensus. And the thing about Honey Badger is it doesn't care about the timing of it as long as it eventually arrives. Yep. Okay, so it's like the use case makes sense.
Yep.
And so my understanding is that these kind of 16 hotspots that would run the consensus algorithm, they would shift over time, like randomly kind of selected. Okay. And then this doesn't scale very well is the idea. So if you have 1,000 hotspots, it's okay. But if you have 1 million, then it's not really, I guess, going to work out. What actually is the exact problem of why can't you scale this up from 1,000, hotspots to why do you need validators when you go to 1 million hotspots?
Yeah, just fundamentally, you are running up against a lot of the limitations of what a hotspot actually is from a sort of storage and resource perspective. One of the things, so in the first version of the Helium hotspot, if you look online, it's the white square with the black circle. Right? That's the first one that Helium Inc. built. We built 15,000 or 17,000 of them. The community calls them OGs. Right? They've a lot of these are still running. But some of them are 3 years old. Right? Almost 3 years old. And the storage, for example, in the Helium hotspot, the OG hotspot, is based on an SD card. And so at some point, that thing just doesn't want to write any more data, right? And so, now you have to at some point go in and actually change the SD card.
Sure.
And it's not something that we planned for because we didn't anticipate things getting this big, this fast. And so in that specific case, you both you do run the risk of having to store more data than the SD card can handle, but more likely you just it outlives its life as a thing that can actually write data to it. So that's one of the things, right? And in some cases, when it comes to RAM, right? So 1 gig or 2 gigs of RAM in these things, when they're reading in a block or reading in a series of blocks and keeping that in memory, that gets hard because it sort of gets too big for them to sort of hold there and process before it gets written to the blockchain itself.
Right.
So those are the sorts of things that we sort of had to get away from. The bigger problem and the most common problem on the network is syncing. So a hotspot, when it first gets deployed, has to sync the entire chain locally. We do some tricks to basically, you sync everything back to what's known as like a blessed sort of snapshot point. So we maintain these snapshot images of the software, of the blockchain software, and then you get it locally. And as long as you're at the most recent snapshot, you can sort of proceed after that. But due to the network, that you're running on potentially being slow and getting disconnected, it sometimes is very painful to sync the blockchain locally. And so you get into a situation where these things are out of sync, right? So people spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get them fully synced. A lot of the manufacturers are trying to do tricks to sort of speed up the sync. But if you're, I think it's like 3,600 blocks behind the blockchain, which is like 2.5 days worth of blocks, you're considered offline, right? So you're not useful to the network, and not only you're not useful, you're not earning any HNT for providing coverage. Right. So those sorts of issues are not sustainable. Okay. Right? We have to make those things go away. So light hotspot, which is very closely tied to validators, basically means you are, as a hotspot, running the most minimal software package possible to get LoRaWAN packets from a device back to the network. And you have some small knowledge of where you have to communicate with the blockchain, but you have like 98% of those requirements go away. And so, in that world where we have 100,000 of these or 1 million of these hotspots that are still running Raspberry Pis and being responsible for consensus and constantly dropping off of line, we can't come to consensus reliably, right? And when that happens, token generation lags where it's supposed to be, right? We're so, at this point, we're supposed to do 2.5 million HNT every month. Sometimes we don't hit that mark. Right, because if our block time average drops from 59.5 seconds, or I guess increases from 59.5 up to like 75 seconds, like less HNT gets produced. Right. So that's something that we had to fix.
I see. So this might be common in kind of blockchain space. I just don't know about it. What's the motivation behind having such a high kind of barrier to entry in order to be a validator? So, now $200,000.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not that. It's not as high in, I think, most other proof of stake networks. I mean, Bitcoin, for example, I think you have to stake 30 BTC, right? Which is what, 180,000 US, give or take. That way, So back to what I said before, when it was at $3 US and we asked for 10,000, or the network said 10,000 as a stake. Sure. We got a lot of pushback. What's fascinating about Helium is that I think, in addition to being the largest blockchain out there, we've done more to introduce people to the idea of crypto mining than I think anyone else has. Yeah. Right. So, Bitcoin mining, the barrier to entry is tens of thousands of dollars and a data center, right? With Helium, it's like $400 US. And we've had a lot of people mining HNT for a long time. Mm-hmm. And so there are a lot of people and entities out there that have enough to stake a node, or in some cases, you see a lot of people pooling HNT. And there's some services that have sprung up, like Helium Rising is a good one, for example, that will let you, pool HNT. We just decided that we wanted that level of commitment. In addition to requiring 10,000 HNT, you also have to commit to a 5-month cooldown period. And what that means is, so in these staking networks, you want to incentivize commitment in some way, right? So you want people to be committed to processing transactions for you. And there are specific reasons why you want tokens to be committed for as long as possible. Right. So we ask for 5 months, meaning if you decide that you want to stake a validator, you stake some HNT through a couple of command line interface things, and it's there. And then if for some reason you say, I don't want to stake HNT anymore, maybe the price goes up and you want to sell, or maybe the price goes down and you want to sell, you can unstake that HNT, but it stays locked for 5 months. So you can't actually get it back until 5 months into the future. You can't move it out of that wallet and do anything with it until 5 months in the future. And again, we actually, the community said, well, we'll see how many validators we get staked. And if no one's doing it because it's too expensive or the lockup period is too long, we'll change it. But we haven't had to do that. Because people are just very committed to being part of this. Got it.
And when it comes to voting for HIP, how are votes distributed? Does it depend on how much HNT you have, or do validators have the same voting rights?
Yeah. So governance is hard, right?
Sure.
And all these blockchain systems. It's very early, like it's incipient, meaning like it's very early stages for all this stuff. Sure. I don't think I've seen a blockchain project that I think has totally nailed voting and governance. Yeah. So we're getting pretty close. So the system that we currently have, which is still a work in progress, but I think a pretty good system, is HIP is sort of proposed. It gets debated in a few different venues. It gets debated pretty frequently in sort of a dedicated Discord channel. There's a monthly community call where people join. We just had our latest one yesterday where hundreds of people join and they debate different things and they talk about different agenda items. And then, there'll be one-off sort of like Discord-based calls to sort of discuss things. With simple HIPs, like that is an obvious change that the network is going to need. Yeah. Sometimes it's just put to a quick up-down vote inside of a Discord channel. Okay. And if it gets approved there, then say, great, HIP, whatever is approved. If they're more contentious, or if they are larger changes to the network that should have, unanimous approval, and typically we go with 2/3 majority, right? So if 65 66% of people vote for it.
Yep.
We'll approve it. HIP, what was it? I forget the name of the HIP, but recently a HIP was introduced to redenominate HNT. So helium has a cap supply, right? So there's only so HIP 20, since we're on the topic of HIPs, introduced the idea of a max HNT supply. So when the network was first founded, there was no cap to it.
Yep.
But we do have a deflationary mechanism in data credits. So if you want to send data, if you want to onboard a hotspot, if you want to send HNT from wall to wall, there's a transaction fee associated with that. And that burns a specific small amount of HNT to do anything.
Sure.
So every time you onboard a hotspot, for example, the blockchain charges you $50 worth of HNT. And the makers and the manufacturers burn tremendous amounts of HNT as the utility to onboard that hotspot, to the point now where if you look at all the layer one blockchains, so Ethereum, Solana, Avalanche, Helium, all these blockchains, we are the third highest in terms of blockchain protocol revenue month on month, meaning every month roughly $5 or so million worth of HNT gets burned for transactions. So that's data from sensors, hotspot onboarding, everything else. So HIP 20 introduced a max supply, which basically said, the deflationary mechanism for burning HNT is good, and over time that will result in less HNT sort of being in existence, and crypto communities like scarcity, right?
Sure.
They don't want to buy anything that's uncapped and sort of hold anything that's uncapped. But in addition to that, it might be useful to figure out how to cap the number of HNT that is produced. And so we introduced a system that basically puts us on the same halving schedule as Bitcoin. So every 2 years, we have the number of HNT that are produced month on month. So when the network was launched, it was 5 million a month. Now we're at 2.5 million a month.
Okay.
The next halving is August of 2023. So it'll drop to 1.25 million a month. And I think the most HNT that will ever exist is something like 239 million, but it'll be much less than that due to all the burn that's happened.
Sure.
So we now have a system that caps it. And the HIP for that was HIP 20, that was debated. I started talking about redenomination. So redenomination is the idea that essentially the Helium token should appear smaller in terms of, or rather, when you mine an HNT, or when you mine any amount of HNT, it's more useful to mine more of the token. What I mean by that is, at this point, like the average hotspot, I don't know the exact number, but might mine like 0.25 HNT a week.
Sure.
There's a perception issue where 0.25 HNT doesn't feel like a lot. Right. And so the community introduced this idea of redenominating at 1,000 to 1, where basically, the price of HNT, or rather the amount of HNT that one earned, would essentially be, what we're doing is just moving the decimal place, like 4 to the right, 3 to the right. So it's 1,001 redenomination.
Yep.
And that was, hotly debated. And so that was put to a vote. And so we have a system. There's a site called heliumvote.com where you will go, and if you want to vote for a certain proposal, you have the number of votes that are the number of tokens that you hold.
I see.
And so if you want to vote for a certain proposal, you go through a process to basically where you burn a small amount of HNT against the wallet address. That's either the for or against.
I see.
And then we tally those against the actual vote.
Okay. And with a possible redenomination, would the exchange rate between data credits and HNT change also, or no?
So on the topic of redenomination, that's actually it was passed. It passed fairly overwhelmingly. It wasn't a landslide, but it was pretty heavily in favor of redenomination. And that was slated to be implemented in Q1 of this year.
Okay.
The community has actually since put that on hold, and we're going to revisit it in August for a variety of reasons.
Okay.
One of the reasons was that there might be some issues with data credit economics specifically.
Yep.
And there's I don't completely understand it, but I think there's a very specific corner case where we might end up burning way too much HNT as we make the transition and like doing bad things. So that's been put on hold until August.
Okay. And could you explain actually what is this idea of data credits
Mm-hmm.
versus HNT? And
Sure.
in order to send data, you need data credits.
Yeah. So HNT is a utility token. So it's crafted specifically for usage within the Helium blockchain. Right? It fundamentally, it has value elsewhere because people decided to put it on exchanges and trade it and buy it and sell it. But fundamentally, it is constructed to be used as a network participant. So you're a network participant when you onboard a hotspot. You're a network participant when you send HNT. You're a network participant when you send data from a mousetrap back to the internet. And so you have the Helium token, which is a utility token, and then you have data credits, which is almost like a dollar-pegged stable coin. Okay. What I mean by that is when you want to transact on the network, that transaction requires some amount of data credits. And it's generally based on the amount of the actual size of the transaction that is being sent across the network. Mm-hmm. So with LoRaWAN, for example, when you send 24 bytes or up to 24 bytes of sensor payload, so sensor payload would be temperature reading, whatever, encoded in whatever format you want to encode it, that will cost you 1 data credit. And so data credits are produced by burning HNT. Mm-hmm. And there's sort of 2 ways to think about the conversion rate. And we designed this very specifically for a few reasons. So back to the discussion about sort of vertical use cases, a lot of the people that use the Helium network don't know anything about crypto. They don't care to know anything about crypto. In fact, a lot of cases it scares them, right? What is this blockchain thing? I don't want to be using this. I just want to send data. Definitely. So in that case, you don't have to know anything about crypto. And traditionally, if you're using like a commercial LoRaWAN network, you sign up with a service, you put in a credit card, you pay them, a lot of money for connectivity plus a bunch of other support and services. With Helium, we crafted the data credit mechanism specifically so that, again, I'll use this Victor example. So, they've got, let's say, 10,000 traps, right? And they know that those traps are going to cost, or that those traps send 500 packets a year. Yep. And so, they know exactly how many packets a year they're going to send, and they want to know what the cost of that service is going to be. With data credits, you can dial that in precisely. You can say, I'm going to send 10 million packets a year from all my sensors, and the exact cost. Right, the exact cost of 10 million packets on the Helium network is $100. Right, so every US dollar buys you every US dollar buys you 100,000 data credits. It's $0.00001 per data credit. Got it. So I think 10 million packets is $100, right? So as the mousetrap company, Victor, you can always know that the cost of your service is going to be $100 a year for every single one of your devices. Right. And you never have to touch crypto if you don't want to. Conversely, and what we see a lot of people doing is they deploy network coverage, and Victor's doing this. You deploy network coverage, you earn HNT for providing that public utility, and then you take that HNT and you burn it yourself, and you use that to pay for your traffic. And so by creating the network coverage and letting other people use it, you in turn generate enough HNT, which can be burned into data credits, and that makes your service run. And it's funny to watch enterprises sort of grasp that, because they start by saying, I don't know about this blockchain thing and this public network. Yeah. And then eventually you talk through, like, well, listen, you're going to use LoRaWAN. You've already decided on that. Right. You're going to have a fixed cost to roll out this network if it doesn't exist. You might as well deploy Helium and then get your data traffic for free. Got it. And they go, oh, yeah. That's interesting. So I don't know if that explains it adequately enough. But, it's a fixed sort of known cost to transacting. Specifically when it comes to enterprises and developers, it's a known fixed cost for sending data from devices that's based on the token itself, HNT. Right, I understand. So it's basically to kind of detether it from HNT, because that's right. If you came to me and said that, it'll cost a tenth of an HNT a day to use his mousetrap, I would say, okay, great. Is a Helium token worth like $10 or is it worth like $10,000? Right. So okay, that makes sense. So basically kind of make it easy for people to know. And by the way, if, say that mousetrap, for example, how much money does it cost or data credits, however you like, and that, maybe goes down and signals that there's a mouse cut in there. How much does that cost to send out that signal? Right. So I don't know the exact firmware settings, but every day it sends a heartbeat packet. So a lot of these sensors have what's called a heartbeat, which just says like, I'm alive. I'm alive. Right. And if it doesn't check in every 24 hours and, their app sends you messages to say, check it off. So every day it's, 0.001 for that. And then, you don't catch a mouse every day. Hopefully. Let's say you catch one a month. Right. So, these ones I have not actually used in my house. I do have I live in an old house. So we tend to catch mice. And so, let's just say once a month, right? You catch a mouse. So that's ballpark at 365.12, so 377. And then we'll round up for some other stuff. So we'll call it 500 packets a year. Okay. Do some back of the envelope math here. 0.00001 500. What's that? It's like literally
like a penny or something.
It's 0.005. It is half. It's 0.005 US$ every year for a single trip.
Okay, so half a cent a year.
Yeah, or to if you deployed 200 of those, it would cost you $1.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. That's pretty amazing.
Also considering, again, like for me personally, my demise has just been replacing batteries on things every 6 months.
And that's intended to last 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And especially, the use case I think is pretty clear of most of the stuff I need for IoT stuff is send 1 or 2 pings a day. Okay, awesome. Let's see, got a lot of the networking stuff down. I did want to ask you, again, we'll cut this if it's kind of a useless question. Mm-hmm. The white paper talks about this proof of serialization and like proof of location.
Yeah.
I didn't really understand a lot of the details. And also, I'm not sure if the details were really included. Is that something that Helium is doing, or is it just proof of coverage these days?
So primarily we're using proof of coverage. White papers have a way of getting out of date as requirements for the project change.
Yeah, sure.
Proof of serialization never really made into the project as a formal sort of proof. I think we use some of that logic under the hood. Proof of location is interesting. So we don't have any sort of formal. There's nothing formal about proof of location that's built into the network from an HNT earnings perspective, but we do have some mechanisms in the blockchain that actually aren't really used very effectively and aren't really advertised too well, where you can, when you get enough density of coverage, basically start to make assertions about the location of a sensor that's transmitting on the network. So you can do it now, right? If you have one hotspot in the middle of nowhere, and you can kind of trust it, right? Yeah. If you're in Boston, right, or Los Angeles, where you have 6,000 hotspots, and you start to get multiple copies of a packet, for example. We see this a lot where, so we've got this website, this project called Mappers, so it's mappers.helium.com, where thousands of people in the community now will go out and map coverage in certain geographies using a GPS-based LoRa sensor. Yep. And so in some cases, right, if you're mapping a big city, you get 10, 15, 20 copies of a single packet. Yeah. And so when you start getting that number of copies of data, you can run some algorithms on top of that using the GPS, the asserted GPS location of the hotspot and a few other variables, you can start to get a really, generally trustable proof of location. And so we've seen a couple interesting use cases come out of the network where there's one called Hive Mapper, which is a project that's doing video mapping of infrastructure, right? So they make a very inexpensive camera that goes on like a dashboard, and then they incentivize people to map coverage with their own token. Actually seeing a lot of this on top of Helium. And then, so obviously video takes much more backhaul than the LoRaWAN component, but they also are building in a LoRa module to do telemetry and sort of location verification of these things. And so we've been talking to parties like that a lot about how to use the blockchain properties to do what would traditionally be called proof of location. LoRaWAN itself has some capabilities with a few of their gateway models that use something. This name always cracks me up. It's called fine timestamping, where if you can get nanosecond level timestamps off of a gateway, you can start to do some relatively trustable time difference over the air, TDOA it's called, TDOA as it's called. But we've gotten to the point where we have so much coverage that you can basically get a decent sense of how to trust a sensor based on the density of coverage and basically triangulating between hotspots.
Got it. How? I was aware that you basically need nanosecond time. Like nanosecond timing gives you meter resolution roughly. Mm-hmm. Is it kind of too expensive to have that nanosecond? It sounds like some of the
yeah. I mean, the gateways. I'm trying to remember why it didn't really proliferate. I think the gateway models that supported it were always too expensive.
Yeah.
And I feel like Semtech had some very tricky pricing model around actually paying for the firmware that enabled the defined timestamps.
Got it.
And so, yeah, it never. Yeah. And what happens with lower wind coverage too is you get sort of a mixed bag of hardware capabilities, right? Especially when you're thinking about it being built as public coverage. Like if one entity is building with this gateway model and the other entity is building with that gateway model, they're not going to be the same SKU essentially. So that ends up complicating things.
Yeah. So I had some questions for you about kind of like end game sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. Right now, Helium, I'm not sure if it's exponential. I'll put in the numbers to see, but really rapid growth in the number of hotspots. What happened? First of all, is there kind of a timeline of when you think things will be, 90% built? And second of all, what happens when the Helium network is, covers 90% of the globe or whatever you might like it to be?
Yeah. It's hard to really assert when we might be at 90% saturation. Mm-hmm. I think more likely we start to just check off major cities and then eventually regions and then countries. Again, back to the United States, I think if you look at any football city, we used to always talk about football cities. Like, where will we launch? We'll be in the football cities. There's 28 or 30 NFL teams. Sure. They all live around major cities. Let's just get football city coverage. But we sort of backed off that city by city plan because we just let the community take us where they wanted to bring us. I don't know what that timeline looks like. It's not going to be 6 months, but I don't think it's going to be 5 years, for example. Yeah. I think Helium Inc's vision, so our vision as a sort of a company, in starting the network was to obviously change the model for how this is deployed, but eventually get to the point where it's ubiquitous, not just for IoT, but for everything, right? For high bandwidth devices, for tablets. And so we believe that there's a future here where a consumer basically treats the Helium-enabled network as one unified thing. Right. And so wherever you go, there's always access to the Helium network, and you are always accessing that network using either the token directly to pay for it, or something that's a derivative, right? Some application that's integrated, HNT sort of token economics, and enables you to pay for coverage via the token. Mm-hmm. So we think, if we look at a 10-year plan, right, we think that's where the community and the network is going to go, basically changing the construction and then the access to all this connectivity based on the incentive mechanism.
Okay. And how does Helium, the company, Helium Inc., make money now? Mm-hmm. And how will it be making money, 10 years from now?
Yeah. So we've as I mentioned earlier on in this conversation, we used to have commercial sort of products. For IoT and sensors and verticals. Today, we have a very large HNT treasury, right? So because we are like a founder of the network, we have a sizable stake in the network. And then we've raised a fair amount of venture capital. Sure. We've tried very hard over the last 2 or 3 years to specifically not build things that weren't focused on building coverage and proving out the utility of the blockchain itself, and obviously focusing very much on the core blockchain software and tooling build out. As we move into 2022, you will see us do some things that look more like traditional sort of products and services on top of the layer one Helium blockchain and HNT. The first thing that we've rolled out is a commercial roaming service. So I mentioned before that we're doing these roaming agreements between Helium Inc. And or the Helium network rather, and other LoRaWAN network service providers. Public decentralized wireless network that provides access to sensors. Helium Inc. Sort of facilitates roaming agreements in between us or the network and other companies, and we have a product that is sort of an enterprise version of that. And we'll have some other layer 2 products that exist on top of the blockchain that sort of become more obvious, I would say, in the next 3 to 6 months.
Okay.
But today we're still very, very focused on, increasing the utility of the blockchain.
Okay, got it. What are the biggest roadblocks you think for this kind of going forward? Next, I don't know what time scale you want, next couple of months or next couple of years?
So, supply chain, always roadblocks with the supply chain, but that's getting...
It's improving.
It's improving, but we'll have new problems, right? So as we move from LoRaWAN to cellular, we'll, I'm sure, hit some supply chain issues with that, but the community will sort of overcome them. We're now getting to the point where we're big enough and known enough where we're on the radar of big companies who might see us as a threat. I think we're in a pretty funny position with these companies because I can guarantee you, in talking to them, I know this, we are there's a weekly sort of executive sync meeting that happens, and it's 60 minutes long, and agenda item 3 of 15 is helium. And I think those conversations are always the same. Like, these guys are interesting. What are they doing? How do we work with them? What's a blockchain? Well, what's a blockchain? How do we work with a blockchain? So I think figuring out how the network part collaborates with established infrastructure vendors is a thing that we need to do. Sure. We've talked to most of these companies. We continue to talk to most of these companies. Dish, for example, we already have a great partnership with them. Yeah. Usually what it takes is one sort of bleeding edge cowboy sort of thing to get everybody else to be like, all right, well, let's just figure it out. Sure. And there's a lot of reasons why an ISP and an MNO would want to partner with the network in some way. Primarily it's because I think it would probably bring them more customers, right? Yeah. At this point, our community is millions globally. People are very committed to being part of the network. You probably want to maybe consider using an ISP that is partnering with Helium for a variety of reasons. So that's something that we have to sort of think about a lot more. As we move into new wireless protocols, we have to think pretty heavily about how to ensure that everyone is incentivized correctly. So, start with LoRaWAN, all of HNT sort of got distributed amongst the LoRaWAN coverage providers, and then, now Validators, and then there's a group of investors that capture some HNT. As we move into cellular, right, if you look at handset traffic, it's much higher in terms of the amount of data.
And handsets, you just mean cell phones?
Yeah, sorry, cell phone. Yeah. Anything with a SIM card. Right.
Fair.
And so, you're going to use orders of magnitude more data on a 30-second FaceTime call than you would in 10 years of a mousetrap, right? And so the blockchain, needs to incentivize you to sort of carry that traffic on behalf of the consumer. And if you're being paid, let's say about the gigabyte, a lot more data credits are going to be consumed, and a lot more HNT will be rewarded to that hotspot that routes that traffic. There's a potential issue there where a protocol like 5G just sucks all the HNT out of the room, right? And you don't want that to happen because you want people who are building the LoRaWAN network to maintain their coverage and feel like the incentive is worth it and that they're part of it. So there's a proposal recently in the community called the Helium DAO. Are you familiar with the DAO, DAO?
Yeah, it's distributed, something organization.
Yeah, distributed autonomous organization. Yeah, basically, it's like a sort of a chunk of resources, typically capital, that's sort of brought together amongst a bunch of different parties to do a specific thing. Yeah. And so there is a proposal to form or to basically allow for something called a Helium DAO, which would say, you want to do LoRaWAN, you want to do 5G, you want to do Wi-Fi, on top of HNT, you can define your own economics. I was talking about this earlier in the context of satellites. Sure. You'll have your own token. You can reward things specifically as you want to do so on top of that. So, figuring out how to properly incentivize all the new wireless protocols that we could sort of tackle and making sure that the incentive mechanism is still robust enough across all those protocols is a heavy area of thinking for us.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And maybe I should probably ask this earlier, but the physical network, with the hotspots runs on the Helium blockchain. Mm-hmm. Is there any concern that the physical hotspots could be kind of, I guess, maybe hijacked, and like someone could run like a different blockchain on the miners. I'm not sure if would be a good thing or a bad thing.
So it's not too different from any other device that you put on your network from a security perspective. I mean, you can do more or less to lock it down in terms of, building a DMZ and making sure that it has no access to local traffic. Like, these are configurations that are possible.
Sure.
With the Helium Network, we recommend pretty actively in our documentation. Due to the sort of limited resource footprint on the hotspot, you couldn't really run anything.
Yeah, it's just not that powerful.
All that crazy. But I will say, it's a blockchain, it's open source. Someone wants to go fork it and try to convince people to run their version of the blockchain. Go off, go ahead, do it. Good for you. We would be sort of interested to, we don't want that to happen, but if it did, sure, fine. One of the things that we're sort of thinking about a lot is, because we have such a huge footprint now, what are the other things that could happen? Yeah. I don't think our thoughts there are too well formed, but we get contacted pretty frequently by other blockchain projects that sort of see the Helium network as a foundation for something that could be sort of edge processing. So I'd say it's super early there, but there are definitely some possibilities.
Yeah. Kind of a random question. If you weren't working on Helium, so building out a decentralized LoRa network and eventually other wireless networks, do you have any ideas on what you'd be, what kind of projects excite you besides Helium? Either in crypto or just in the world.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of us at Helium are traditionally like crypto and blockchain skeptics.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's sort of a thing that we did out of a necessity, I think, and I still like I. How should I best answer this? I think if you'd asked us if we wanted to build a blockchain again, we'd say no, right? And I think if we had done this now versus 3 years ago, we would probably end up using something like Solana, for example, which has a lot of interesting properties for a system like ours. We did it because we had to, right? We didn't have a blockchain that would run on a Raspberry Pi. We didn't have anything that would look like that looked like proof of coverage that would help us sort of verify systems. I haven't really thought too deeply about what I'd probably be focusing on if it weren't for something like Helium. Probably just playing a lot of golf, to be honest with you. There's lots of golf and poker and spending time with my family and kids. There's some other stuff in the blockchain space that I think has a ton of potential. I think a lot of these token incentivized usage models for consumer devices are really fascinating. Sure. So, I mentioned one called Hive Mapper. There's another one called DIMO, D-I-M-O, which is it's an OD. So cars have something called an ODB2 sensor. So any car built after 1992 or 1996 has an input below the steering wheel, like typically below on the right, where you can just plug something in and it gives you the same exact data that your like it gives you like 40 pieces of fascinating data from your car, but no one tells you about it because the dealers just want to charge you money to come in and get the light turned off. So they make but you can go up on Amazon and buy an ODB2 sensor, and typically they pair with a phone over Bluetooth, or they just have like a little digital readout. So there's a company called DIMO, which doesn't use the Helium network today, but is looking at integrating it for connectivity, that has an Ethereum-based token for basically aggregating ODB2 data from cars. So I love that model. Yeah. I talked to a company, I won't share their name because I think they're very much still in stealth, but they're building this sort of fascinating, I think it's called a dendrometer, a sensor for measuring tree growth. Right, I don't remember the exact mechanism. I'm remembering the photo though. So basically, let's say that this is a sapling or something. You clip a clip to the side of the tree, and then they have this this sensor. I don't even remember what it's called, but as the tree basically grows, like day on day, it tracks like super tiny changes in the width of the tree, essentially. And so they're building a LoRa module into their sensor.
Sure.
And their customers are forestry departments, but they think that they have a huge market for it with consumers. And specifically what they want to do, or this is very early stage for them, but they discuss the idea that they might incentivize people to gather tree data with a token. And so you can imagine, much like people are deploying hotspots to build this incentive-based wireless network, imagine someone saying, hey, listen, there's a there's 5,000 trees in your town, right? And there's an aftermarket for that data. So, we're interested in giving you a token or compensating you in a token for going out and literally deploying this thing that screws into a side of the tree and sends us, 3 measurements a day on, the growth, right? And we can correlate that with health. We can look at weather patterns. We can tell you it's getting too much water or too little, not enough water. Yeah. Those models are fascinating. And another one, just because we're talking about it, imagine Scoot or like Lime bikes.
Sure. Yeah.
But instead of it being owned by Lime, you as a consumer purchase and maintain the bikes, and then as they get used, you earn a token for basically their operation over time. Yeah. So those models I think are really fascinating. So maybe I'd find myself sort of working on something like that.
Sure.
I like those a lot.
Oh, yeah, those are all sound interesting. Before you said it, I was going to ask you, what's the point of measuring tree growth? My arborist friend would kill me. But it makes sense. Yeah. One question I skipped over that I actually want to get back to just quick while we're at the end here. The question was, okay, you have a blockchain mechanism for distributing this network around. There's like 10,000 tokens or something like that. Like in the world. It's like crazy. And like every time I have to learn about a new one, it's just like, God, why? The question is like, does Helium have to, and now it's probably too ingrained to switch, but is there kind of a deep technical reason why you need HNT to run this network as opposed to just using, like Ethereum, or to give a bad example, Bitcoin?
There is now, right? The foundational blockchain is proof of coverage. And, the token itself is produced by this blockchain that relies on proof of coverage. I think if we were to build it again today, right, the functionality, we might opt for like a layer 2 sort of thing, again, on top of something like Solana. We actually know the Solana team quite well. They were getting off the ground in San Francisco when we were, a little after we were getting off the ground. And so we sort of just knew them pretty well. But at that point, like, you're a startup and they're a startup, and startups banking their businesses on other startups is generally not that advisable. So, we just said, well, we'll go build our own thing. But like I said, if we were to build it again today, we'd probably make different decisions. But here we are.
That's always the case. So it seems kind of, outsider looking in, nice to know that you kind of control everything all the way down to the ground. It's comforting to know that you don't rely on, what some other blockchain is going to be doing.
Although, we certainly don't control everything. Right? We have very good knowledge of how it all works because we were the first to sort of write it. But, this is by design. It's generally in the hands of the community now. If you look at the code contributions a year and a half ago versus where they are now, a lot more come from non-Helium Inc. engineers. Having the system entirely designed to suit the use case is very, very useful.
Right. Yeah. I guess, it seems more comforting to know that, someone in the Helium community is driving, technology changes around the Helium blockchain compared to, I don't really know much at all about Solana, but you can imagine some people running Solana blockchain share their community, and that's going to affect Helium in a way that, you may or may not want. Whereas this is,
one example would be, so we have this mechanism called chain variables. So in the Helium blockchain, a lot of the major sort of functionality is controlled by this thing called the chain variable. So, the amount of tokens produced, the cost of data credits. It's just a big configuration variable. We call them chain variables. Okay. One of the things we recently moved onto the blockchain, which is a pretty unsung piece of technology right now, is basically the ability to enforce geographic wireless specifications on chain, which is pretty wild. So, the idea that if you're a Helium hotspot operating in Europe, you have to use the 868 megahertz band, and you have to comply with local regulations around that. We now have that enforcement on chain, essentially, which is pretty wild. If we were building on Solana, for example, right, we might be able to build it at the layer 2 level on top of whatever specific token we had on top of Solana, but because we have that built into the Helium blockchain, we have very fine-grained control over it. Yeah.
Huh. Okay. And then I think basically just one last question, which is, I was reading the white paper and kind of towards the end, I found something that was actually aligned with the first thing that kind of stuck out to me about this project, which was that Helium's belief is that the blockchains will be less about basically Bitcoin allows you to exchange electricity for, hashing power. Mm-hmm. And so in places where you're really remote or you have cheap access to electricity or geothermal power or whatever, you can convert that into, doing work for other people in a way that's useful. But it's basically just turned into a huge, electricity burning operation. Mm-hmm. And what Helium pointed out in the white paper was that rather than just looking at blockchains as a way to burn electricity, you can kind of convert some unique service that you have into, something that you get financially rewarded for and is helpful to others. So what Helium specifically does is, I guess, converts a location that's good for broadcasting, LoRa, or it lets you utilize the fact that you have a location that's good for broadcasting, or you found a few mm-hmm. locations. There's other coins. I'm not sure if there's a general, I think Filecoin is a name of a coin, but the general idea is you could kind of lease out the, hard disk space you have on your computer, or you could lend out the GPU power you have. There's like a render coin. Mm-hmm. What do you think about this in general? Do you think that there's kind of more opportunities for lending out some, kind of personal thing that you have on a blockchain type of service?
Yeah. So, this is somewhat related to those projects I was talking about a minute ago, right? Demo and Hive Mapper, and the plant one and the bike one. Filecoin, so it is Filecoin. FIL is the name of the token. Feel. Filecoin's. We paid a lot of attention to Filecoin early. When the company was younger, like 2014, 15. Sure. When a lot of these crypto projects were sort of getting started. Most of them are not around anymore, right? As you mentioned before. Yeah. As the cycles sort of go in the wrong direction, a lot of these projects that don't really have any utility sort of get shaken out. I think we're due for that again, by the way. I think if you look at the top 100 in CoinMarketCap rankings, now versus 12 months, I think it's going to look a lot different. So Amir and the team, we read the Filecoin white paper pretty early and said, "Oh, that's interesting, right?" Basically, you build something around a utility. In this case, Filecoin, you're proving that you have usable storage. And with Render, RNDR is the token name. Those guys are still pretty early. They're on Ethereum now. I think they're switching to Solana in the future. At least they've stated they have. You're leasing out GPU capabilities. I think there's a tremendous amount of potential there, especially when you consider that as people get more comfortable, I think, with participating in these networks, and the level of entry or the barrier to entry is dropped. Like Filecoin, for example, you still have to spend a tremendous amount of money and resources on deploying servers. And there's a very specific and complicated and sort of complex system for how you build and maintain a Filecoin server, and how many FIL you have to have sort of staked against it to operate. But it works, right? They have petabytes upon petabytes of storage available. I don't know how many people actually use it, but the infrastructure is there. Right. Render, again, is still pretty early, but I think people are using it. Yeah. But as you start to lower the barrier to entry for people to participate in this, I think they're just going to explode, right? I think Helium, we've been told that a lot of companies are pitching their product as the Helium of X, which is quite hilarious to us, because we started pitching this thing as the Uber for wireless, right? Or the Airbnb for wireless, right? Sure. You become your own little MVNO, your own little operator. Yeah. It's wild to hear people saying, "Oh, we're the Helium of X." But I think the model where you basically convert, prosumers, meaning like people who are more technically inclined but are consumers, but more generally consumers, into paying users of a product that includes them in the upside, it's hard to argue that that's not going to be massive. Yeah. So I think it's going to be a big deal.
I certainly find it attractive. I do a lot of machine learning stuff on my laptop. You've heard the fan going.
Is that what that was? I was wondering what that was.
It has a massive GPU in it, and I just want Render to kind of progress a little bit more, because I feel like
do you think so I have a friend who was a computer science student at Berkeley, PhD at Berkeley in computer science, now runs a machine learning optimization company that actually just got acquired, and when I was reading about Render, I called him up. I was like, his name's Neil. I was like, Neil, is this going to work? And he hates crypto. He thinks it's the worst thing in the world. And that's why I like to bounce ideas off of him, because you want to have skeptics in something that you think is interesting. And he's like, I don't know, man. Probably not. And then I said, all right, that's useful. And then, I went out and bought a bunch anyways. So I think that I would like to see Render succeed. I mean, I think it could be remarkably private. It sounds like you have a use case for it immediately.
Yeah, I like the crypto space, but I don't know a ton about it. I actually just heard about them when I was researching Helium a little bit. I was like, oh, wow, like that, because I heard about Filecoin. There was something similar at MIT a few years ago. I don't know what happened to that project. But anyways, I heard about Render. I was like, oh, that would be amazing. I don't know. I haven't looked into any of the technical details, so I don't know if it's really viable. But it kind of kills me sometimes just to have, whatever, a couple $1,000 GPU just sitting around not being used. It's like, why do I have this thing? So we'll see. Those are all the questions that I had. I wanted to say thank you so much for coming out.
Yeah, my pleasure. This was a blast.
Was there anything else that you thought we should talk about or cover? Let me just say, looking up this project, first of all, really interesting, but there is so many kind of facets to this project. There's the RF engineering side of it, obviously the blockchain part of it, redistribution of and verification of networks. Really cool project to learn about. So I might have missed something. I don't know.
No, I mean you I have the pleasure of doing a lot of these conversations. Your research was more extensive than most. We covered. I think we've given people plenty of things to dig into if they want to continue after this. I mean, the one thing I would say is that if you want to get involved, places to start are Helium. Maybe I'll put some links in the.
I'll put all the links up. Yeah,
Helium.com, discord.gg/Helium. I'll just sort of caveat that by saying Discord is a wild place that needs to be sort of treated very specifically. Helium Twitter, the Helium subreddit is very active. There's like 100,000 subs on there now with a bunch of people that are active. I'm just Fark Millips, PharkMillips on Twitter. Get involved. We'd love to be out there with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much.
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. This was great.
Yeah, hope to keep in touch.